Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into something that'll make you grateful for that little air conditioning unit humming away in your bedroom. Picture this. It's July 1847, and you wake up in a home where the thermometer has already climbed past 90 degrees, and it's not even breakfast time yet. The walls around you are brick or clapboard, absorbing heat like a slow cooker set on low. Your cotton nightshirt is already soaked through. There's no button to push, no thermostat to adjust, no relief in sight. Just you, your family, and the relentless, suffocating heat that'll dominate your existence until November finally rolls around. You probably won't survive this summer. At least that's what the newspapers keep warning about, especially if you're poor, very young, or very old. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, if you're watching from somewhere sweltering right now, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'd love to know where you're riding out the heat. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Welcome to the brutally hot world of 1800s America, where your greatest enemy isn't an invading army or a wild animal, it's the sun itself. What we're about to explore together is how ordinary families, without a single modern cooling device, manage to not just survive but actually live through summers that regularly push temperatures into the triple digits. And I mean live, sleep, work, raise children, preserve food, maintain dignity, all while your body is constantly threatening to betray you. The heat in 1800s. America was different from what you might experience today, even in the hottest cities. There was no respite indoors. There was no going to an air-conditioned shopping mall to cool off for an hour. There was no car with functioning AC to escape to. There wasn't even a movie theatre. Those didn't become ubiquitous until the early 20th century. If you were hot, you stayed hot. And so, you learned to live with it, to organise your entire existence around it, to make peace with the fact that for 4 to 6 months every year, you would be uncomfortable in a way that modern people simply don't experience anymore. This wasn't just about personal discomfort either. Heat killed people. It killed infants who couldn't regulate their body temperature. It killed elderly people whose hearts couldn't take the strain. It sparked epidemics of cholera and dysentery that turned summer into a season of dread. It drove people mad, literally. Heat stroke wasn't understood as a medical condition. It was just something that happened to people. And if they survived, they were lucky. If they didn't, well, that was God's will. But here's what's fascinating. People didn't give up. They didn't just sit in their homes and sweat until September. Instead, they developed incredibly sophisticated strategies for surviving the heat. Some of these strategies were based on sound scientific principles that we still recognize today. Others were pure folk wisdom passed down through generations. Some were so counterintuitive that if someone told you about them without context, you'd assume they were completely insane. Over the next few hours, we're going to walk through those strategies together. We're going to see how geography determined survival odds, how families harvested ice in the winter to use as air conditioning in the summer, how they redesigned their homes and their daily routines to work with the heat instead of against it. We're going to meet people, real people, with names and stories, who faced down 100-degree temperatures with nothing but their wits, their knowledge of their environment, and their determination to keep their families alive. And we're going to see how all of this changed as the century progressed. By the 1890s, people were beginning to imagine a world where you could control temperature mechanically, where summer might not mean suffering. That idea seemed almost magical at the time. We know how the story ends, of course. But back then, it was just a dream, whispered about in the evenings when the heat finally broke and people could think clearly again. So settle in, get comfortable, let the hum of that fan wash over you. Because we're about to travel back in time to a world where the simple act of staying cool required ingenuity, resilience, and a deep understanding of how your environment worked. And by the end of the night, you'll understand something about human adaptation and survival that you didn't know before. The year is 1800, the thermometer is rising, and your story is about to begin. Geography wasn't destiny in 1800s America, but it came pretty close. Where you lived determined almost everything about how you'd experience the heat, and families living in different regions faced radically different challenges. Imagine you're a settler in South Carolina versus a farmer in Vermont. You're living in the same country, the same century, but your summer experience might as well be from different planets. If you lived in the Deep South, heat was your constant companion. Charleston, New Orleans, Savannah, These places didn't just get hot, they got brutally, oppressively hot. We're talking consistent days above 95 degrees, sometimes climbing to 110. But here's the quirky part that historians often overlook. Wealthy families in these regions had actually developed incredibly sophisticated cooling strategies over generations, long before the revolution. They'd learned from Caribbean plantation owners, from enslaved people who brought knowledge from Africa about managing extreme heat, and from pure trial and error experimentation. Some of these families had semi-permanent solutions that actually kept their homes relatively bearable. Compare that to the north, where summers were shorter and less intense, but the shock of the heat was worse because people weren't used to it. A farmer in Massachusetts might experience temperatures in the low 90s for only 6 to 8 weeks a year, but because his body and his home weren't adapted to handle any heat at all, it felt absolutely catastrophic. He'd wake up disoriented, his wooden home would feel like a sauna, and he'd have almost no cultural knowledge about how to manage it. He'd probably just suffer through it, confused and miserable. Then you had the vast middle ground, regions like Ohio, Indiana, and the borderlands where summers were moderately hot, maybe reaching 90 degrees for extended periods, but with the crucial advantage of being near water. A family living on the banks of the Ohio River had access to something invaluable: relatively cool water for bathing, cooling, and drinking. A family 10 miles inland without well access was in serious trouble. That water meant the difference between comfort and desperation. The Appalachian regions presented their own challenges. Higher elevations meant cooler temperatures. A family living at 3,000 feet might experience summers 30 degrees cooler than families in the Piedmont below them. But it also meant geographic isolation. You couldn't just travel to a cooler region if things got desperate. You were locked in by terrain and primitive roads that became impassable in certain seasons. Western territories presented a completely different problem. Settlers moving to California, Arizona, and the Great Plains in the latter part of the 19th century encountered heat that was dry and intense, but often at least available in terms of low humidity. The problem was that many of these regions were essentially deserts. You could experience 100-degree plus temperatures, but the air was so dry that your sweat actually evaporated effectively, which sounds good until you realize that means you can dehydrate without even feeling particularly sweaty. The illusion of comfort could kill you. Historians still argue whether climate migration patterns in the 19th century were primarily driven by economic opportunity or by heat tolerance and seasonal habitability. What we do know is that families would sometimes deliberately choose locations based on their summer temperatures. Northern merchants would spend winters in the south and summers in the north, treating seasonal migration like wealthy people treat ski houses today. But this option was only available to the wealthy. For working families, you lived where the work was, and you suffered through whatever season came. The Great Lakes region occupied an interesting middle ground. Proximity to massive bodies of water meant that these areas experienced moderated temperatures due to the water's thermal mass. Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, they absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, which meant that instead of wild temperature swings, you got relatively consistent, moderately warm summers. Families living in cities like Cleveland or Chicago often experienced less intense heat than people just 50 miles inland. But as those cities grew more crowded later in the century, the urban heat island effect would start to counteract those natural advantages. And then there was the question of ocean access. Coastal families in the northeast had a significant advantage. The Atlantic Ocean stayed relatively cool even in summer, which meant that coastal breezes provided actual relief. A family living in Boston or Portsmouth, New Hampshire might experience only a handful of truly unbearable days each summer, while inland families suffered for weeks. This geographic advantage made coastal real estate valuable not just for commerce, but for simple survivability. The Mississippi and Missouri river valleys created their own microclimates. Living near a major river meant cooler nights, more humidity, which could be both good and bad, and access to water for cooling purposes. But it also meant exposure to riverborne diseases that thrived in the heat and humidity. You couldn't win completely. There were trade-offs to every location. Elevation changes of just 1,000 feet could mean 5 to 10 degree differences in temperature. Families that could afford to spend summers in mountain retreats, the origins of our modern summer home concept, did so. The wealthy would pack up in June and head to places like the Catskills or the White Mountains, leaving their city homes to their servants. By the 1880s, mountain resort towns had become fashionable precisely because they offered escape from urban heat. But again, this was luxury available only to the wealthy. By the late 1800s, people were becoming conscious of geography in new ways. Railroad companies actually started marketing certain routes and destinations based on their cooler summer climates. Colorado Springs was promoted as a health resort, partly because its elevation and dry climate offered relief from the stifling heat of the lowlands. Some families would actually plan their lives around these geographic advantages, timing vacations and moves to take advantage of natural cooling. But for the vast majority of people, geography wasn't a choice. You lived where you were born, or you lived where work took you, and you adapted to whatever climate that meant, summer heat included. The geography of your home determined the temperature of your existence, and that temperature determined how much of your energy and attention would be consumed by the simple act of staying cool. Now we move into one of the most remarkable and largely forgotten technologies of the 1800s, ice harvesting. This was genuinely cutting-edge stuff for its time, and it created an entire economy around the simple idea that if you could cut ice from frozen lakes in winter, store it properly, and ship it across the country, you could bring summer cooling to people who would otherwise have no relief from the heat. You'd think this sounds complicated, but it's actually brilliantly simple, which is exactly why it worked. The process started in winter, usually January or February depending on the climate. In regions with cold winters, like New England, New York and the Great Lakes area, entire communities would wait for the lakes and rivers to freeze thick enough to support harvesting. There were unwritten rules about how thick the ice needed to be, usually at least 12 to 15 inches, because if you went too early, you could break through and drown. Death by falling through ice while trying to harvest ice for summer cooling would have been a particularly cruel and stupid way to go, so people were cautious. Here's the quirky part that most people don't realise. Ice harvesting was a commercial enterprise that employed thousands of people. These weren't individual families cutting ice for their own use. Instead, companies would set up operations on the frozen lakes, bringing teams of workers, special tools and saws. They'd literally carve the ice into massive blocks, usually about 20 inches by 30 inches, and haul them out of the water using horses and specially designed conveyances. On a single good day, a professional ice harvesting operation could cut and store hundreds of tons of ice. The real magic happened in the storage, though. This is where it gets genuinely impressive. Companies built massive ice houses, structures that were often larger than family homes, specifically designed to store ice for months at a time. These ice houses were insulated using sawdust, straw and other organic materials. The ice blocks would be stacked with these insulating materials between them, and the entire structure would be built in a way that minimized sun exposure. Some ice houses had walls several feet thick, packed entirely with insulation. The statistics are mind-boggling if you think about them. A single ice house might store 300 to 500 tons of ice in winter, and actually preserve enough of it through the summer that it could be harvested and shipped throughout the warm months. Ice companies would negotiate with railroads to ship ice across the country. By the 1840s, American ice was being shipped to the Caribbean, and even to India, packed in sawdust for insulation. This was a genuinely major industry. For families that could afford ice, the benefit was extraordinary. A block of ice, maybe £50, delivered to your home, might cost you anywhere from a few cents to $0.25, depending on where you lived and what time of summer it was. That doesn't sound like much until you realise that $0.25 in 1870 was roughly equivalent to $5 today. So ice was expensive. It was a luxury good. Working families would buy small amounts of ice maybe once a week, if that. Wealthier families might have ice delivered several times a week, allowing them to maintain ice boxes, the precursors to modern refrigerators, that would keep food fresh and provide some level of cooling for their homes. An icebox was a relatively simple device that nevertheless represented cutting-edge technology. It was basically an insulated cabinet with a compartment at the top where you'd put your ice block. As the ice melted, it would drain into a collection pan at the bottom that you'd have to empty regularly. This was actually a common household chore for children. The cold air from the melting ice would keep the compartment below it relatively cool, allowing you to store perishable food for a few days instead of a few hours. But here's where it gets really interesting. Ice also provided direct cooling for homes. Wealthy families would place blocks of ice in front of open windows, letting the breeze blow across the ice and into the room. The cooled air would spread through the house, providing actual air conditioning, just mechanical instead of electrical. Some families would place ice in strategic locations around their homes, essentially trying to create air circulation patterns that would cool multiple rooms. On a really hot night, sleeping in a room with an ice block could mean the difference between sleeping and just lying awake all night, soaked in sweat. Historians still argue about how much ice actually penetrated working class and rural life in the 19th century. Contemporary sources suggest that by the 1870s and 1880s, ice was becoming more affordable and more widely available, even in smaller towns. But clearly, the majority of Americans still didn't have regular access to ice. For most families, ice was something you might get on special occasions, maybe a block to help preserve meat for a celebration, or to cool your home during an exceptional heat wave. The ice industry itself created interesting class dynamics. The work of cutting and storing ice was brutal, dangerous, cold, and physically exhausting. The workers who did this labour were often poor immigrants, and the companies that ran these operations were ruthlessly efficient. They'd cut ice in the brutal cold of winter, knowing they'd sell it in the sweltering heat of summer. By the 1880s and 1890s, ice harvesting operations were starting to become less profitable as artificial refrigeration technologies began to emerge, but they remained important right through the turn of the century. One more fascinating detail: the ice that was harvested from natural lakes and rivers sometimes carried the imprint of that location's ecosystem. Ice cut from a polluted urban river might have a faint taste or smell of whatever was in that water. Some ice companies had reputations based on the purity of their source water. The cleanest, most desirable ice came from pristine mountain lakes and deep, cold rivers that were far from human settlement. This created an entire geographic market where ice from certain regions commanded premium prices. For families lucky enough to have ice, even occasionally, it was genuinely transformative. The ability to keep food from spoiling, to sleep in a relatively cool room, to have cold water to drink, these weren't luxuries that modern people understand as luxuries because we take them completely for granted. But in the 1800s, ice represented access to a form of comfort that most of the world's population had never experienced. It represented wealth, modern progress, and connection to a vast commercial system that could transport frozen winter straight to your summer home. The ice houses weren't the only refugees from the heat, though. Deep underground, beneath almost every house and farm, there existed a space that modern people barely even know about anymore: the cellar. For families in the 1800s, the cellar was the single most important room in the house during summer, and its temperature made the difference between merely uncomfortable and genuinely survivable. A properly constructed cellar stayed cool year-round, but especially during summer. Underground spaces naturally maintain a relatively consistent temperature because they are insulated from the atmosphere by several feet of earth. The deeper you go, the more stable that temperature becomes. A cellar that was built with proper ventilation and construction could maintain temperatures in the 50 to 60 degree range, even when it was 100 degrees on the surface. That might not sound air-conditioned by modern standards, but imagine stepping from a 100-degree kitchen into a 50-degree cellar. That's relief so intense it almost hurts. The key to a functional cellar was ventilation. You needed to be able to move cool air into it during the coolest parts of the day and night, and seal it up during the day to prevent warm air from entering. Families developed intricate systems of shutters and doors to manage this airflow. They'd open the cellar doors and windows at night, letting cool air sink into the space, and then carefully close everything as soon as the sun started to warm things up. It required attention and knowledge, but it worked. Cellars served multiple purposes, which meant that different family members would spend different amounts of time down there throughout the day. In the morning, before it got hot, the cellar was where you do your laundry, if you had the energy, though honestly most people avoided hot, strenuous work during summer entirely. By midday, when the outside temperature had climbed to unbearable levels, the cellar became where you'd retreat if you had work that required focus. If you were a merchant or craftsman doing bookwork or detailed labour, you'd move your workspace downstairs, but the most important function of the cellar was food storage. Root vegetables, preserved foods, cheese, butter, anything that needed to stay cool went into the cellar. This is where families kept their ice blocks, if they could afford them. This is where fermented foods would remain stable. For many families, the cellar's reliable cool temperature was the only thing standing between having enough food to eat through the winter and not having enough. Spoiled food during summer didn't just mean wasted resources, it meant starvation in the months to come. Children and elderly people would often spend entire afternoons in the cellar during the worst heat waves. An elderly grandmother might sit in a wooden chair down there for hours, doing needlework or just sitting quietly, avoiding the heat upstairs. Young children might play down there, where it was cool enough that they wouldn't suffer heat exhaustion. The cellar wasn't a pleasant space, it was often damp, poorly lit by narrow windows or not lit at all except by candlelight, and it smelled of earth and stored food. But it was cool, and that was what mattered. Here's a quirky detail that reveals how important cellars were to daily life. Many families would eat their meals in the cellar during the hottest parts of summer. The heat of a kitchen stove made that room absolutely unbearable in summer. So instead of cooking hot meals, families would prepare food in the evening when it was cooler, or they'd assemble cold foods that didn't require cooking. They'd carry these meals down to the cellar and eat them in the cool darkness, sitting at makeshift tables and chairs brought down from upstairs. Some families took this even further. The wealthiest ones actually built their cellars with sleeping spaces, small rooms where family members could sleep during the worst heat waves. These weren't luxurious bedrooms by any standard, but they were functional sleeping spaces with beds or cots, far enough underground that the temperature stayed bearable all night. For someone suffering from heat exhaustion, or the early stages of heat stroke, being able to sleep in a 50-degree room instead than a 90-degree bedroom could actually be life-saving. The construction of cellars was itself a matter of considerable thought and engineering. A properly built cellar had stone or brick walls, a packed dirt floor and minimal windows. It needed to be deep enough, at least 6 to 8 feet below ground level, to benefit from the Earth's thermal mass. It needed ventilation holes or windows positioned carefully to allow air circulation without letting in direct sunlight. The entrances needed to be arranged so that heat rising from outside didn't immediately penetrate the cellar space. In regions where the water table was high, cellars presented real engineering challenges. If groundwater was close to the surface, you'd get a damp, muddy cellar that could become a breeding ground for mould and mildew. Some families had to deal with actual water. Their cellars would partially flood during spring thaw or heavy rain. These wet cellars were actually less useful for living space, though they often worked okay for food storage since that dampness, while unpleasant, actually helped preserve certain foods and keep things cool. Historians still argue about how widespread cellar sleeping actually was. Contemporary accounts suggest it was more common than we'd expect. Families facing genuine heat emergencies would absolutely move sleeping quarters underground. But regular planned use of cellars for sleeping seems to have been rarer, limited mostly to the wealthy who could afford to construct comfortable underground spaces. For most families, the cellar was a storage area and a refuge during the absolute worst heat, not a primary living space. But on the worst days, the ones where the temperature climbed to 105 or higher and people's bodies were starting to fail, the cellar became a sanctuary. It was the closest thing people had to air conditioning, a place where the laws of heat didn't apply with their full force, and when you're facing down a heat emergency, when the thermometer is climbing into dangerous territory and you're worried about your children's or parents' safety, a naturally cool 50-degree space underground starts to feel like an absolute miracle of science and engineering. Now let's talk about something that would seem completely counterintuitive to a modern person, but which made perfect sense in the 1800s: how to dress to survive heat. Everything you've learned about staying cool in hot weather might actually be partially wrong, because clothing in hot climates isn't about wearing less, it's about wearing the right kind of less, and sometimes, surprisingly, about wearing more. Start with the basic principle. Your clothes need to be loose, not tight. Tight clothing traps heat against your skin and prevents sweat from evaporating. Loose clothing allows air to circulate around your body, which means sweat can actually do its job, evaporating and cooling you down. This is why traditional summer clothing in the 1800s involved loose, flowing garments. Men wore loose linen shirts that often hung several inches away from their bodies. Women's summer dresses, despite the restrictive corsets worn underneath in formal settings, were made from lightweight fabrics that draped loosely. But here's where it gets interesting, the colour question. Popular belief today is that you should wear light colours in the heat, and this is actually correct, but the 1800s understanding of why was slightly different. People didn't have the physics of light absorption down perfectly, but they knew from centuries of observation that dark colours felt hotter. So summer clothing was predominantly light: white, pale yellow, pale blue. These colours reflected rather than absorbed sunlight, which kept the clothing cooler, and by extension, kept the wearer cooler. The fabric choice was absolutely critical. Linen was the gold standard for summer. It's a natural fibre that breathes well, allows sweat to evaporate quickly, and becomes softer and more comfortable when wet. Linen is actually one of the most efficient natural fabrics for hot climates. which is why it's been used in hot regions for literally thousands of years. Cotton was the next choice, less ideal than linen but much cheaper and still reasonably breathable. Wool, by contrast, was a winter fabric and considered torture to wear in the heat. Now here's the quirky part that seems completely backwards. Many people in the 1800s, particularly those working outdoors or in very hot climates, actually wore multiple layers during hot days. A worker in the fields might wear a light linen undershirt, a light shirt over that, and sometimes even a light jacket. This seems insane until you understand the reasoning. The layers provided protection from direct sunlight and created dead air spaces that could provide some insulation. More importantly, the layers meant that you weren't exposing skin directly to the sun, which could cause severe burns. A sunburned field worker couldn't work at all, which could be worse than being slightly warmer under extra fabric. Hats were absolutely essential. Every person, from the youngest children to the elderly, wore hats outdoors during the day. For men, these were straw hats, felt hats, or cloth hats, with brims that extended significantly on all sides. For women, hats were even more elaborate, wide-brimmed affairs that could shade not just the face but the shoulders and neck. The wider the brim, the better, because direct sun exposure to the head and neck could lead to heat stroke. A hat wasn't a fashion accessory, it was essential safety equipment. Footwear was also carefully considered. Heavy leather shoes that covered the foot completely were standard, even in hot weather. This seems hot and uncomfortable, but it protected the feet from burns and from the parasites and sharp objects that might be found on the ground. Sandals or barefoot walking was something done only by the poorest people and was generally considered risky. Some families, particularly in hot southern regions, would make concessions for summer, lighter leather or open weaves, but the concept of summer shoes as we know them didn't really exist. For women, the corset question was complicated. Upper-class women were expected to wear corsets even in summer, which was absolutely brutal in the heat. A proper corset of the 1870s or 1880s was a construction of whalebone, steel and fabric that created pressure around the ribs and waist, restricted breathing, and essentially prevented any sort of natural cooling through perspiration. Women in corsets during heat waves would be at serious risk of heat exhaustion because their bodies couldn't regulate temperature effectively. Some women would abandon their corsets during the worst summer heat, considering the social transgression worth the physical relief, but this was risky. Being seen in public without a corset was genuinely shocking. Working-class women had more freedom here. A woman doing physical labour, which most working-class women were, couldn't function in a tight corset, so they'd wear looser stays, or sometimes no corset at all, and a simple dress made of cotton or linen. This was considered less proper, but it was practical. Social class literally determined how much heat a woman had to endure. Children's clothing was somewhat more sensible. Children would often wear simple linen shifts or simple dresses made of light material. As they aged, and particularly as girls approached adolescence, they'd be gradually incorporated into the more restrictive clothing standards of their social class. But young children, especially in rural or working-class families, might wear surprisingly little, just a simple shift of light fabric that would dry quickly if they got wet. Another fascinating detail: people understood that rapid temperature changes could be dangerous, so even though you wanted to get into a cool place, you were supposed to do it gradually. You couldn't go from a 100-degree room straight into a 50-degree cellar. That shock could supposedly make you ill. Families would have protocols about moving gradually toward cooler spaces, allowing your body to adjust. This was folk wisdom that, while not perfectly understood physiologically, was actually based on reasonable observations. Rapid temperature changes can be stressful on the body, especially when you're already heat-stressed. By the late 1800s, as understanding of physics and biology improved, families would become more sophisticated about clothing choices. Some of the excessively restrictive elements would start to loosen up, particularly for women and girls. The rise of the rational dress movement advocated for simpler, less restrictive clothing, partly for heat management and partly for overall comfort and health. But these changes came slowly, and traditional expectations about appearance and propriety meant that heat was still often endured rather than escaped. Water. In the 1800s, water consumption became almost a religion during summer months. Families obsessed over it, where it came from, how clean it was, how much to drink, when to drink it. Water wasn't just something you drank when you were thirsty. It became central to managing heat and avoiding heat illness. Most families didn't have the luxury of safe, clean water on demand. You either lived near a well, a spring, or a river, or you didn't. Families lucky enough to have a well on their property were genuinely privileged. They'd maintain that well carefully, building structures around it to protect it from contamination, keeping it clean, and treating water from it as a valuable resource. A family without well access had to either buy water from a water carrier, someone who would bring water from a public well or spring, or walk to get it themselves. This created interesting social dynamics. In towns, the public wells became gathering places where people would congregate, especially during hot weather. Women would gather there in the cool morning to draw water, and these gatherings became important social events. They were also places where information spread: news, gossip, warnings about disease. If one family came down with cholera or other waterborne illness, the information would travel quickly through the well-using community. The amount of water a person needed to drink during summer was significantly higher than in winter, and families understood this. Working people, farmers, labourers, servants, would drink prodigious amounts of water, sometimes several gallons a day. Water would be kept in pitchers and buckets, refreshed regularly. It would be carried to the fields to workers, kept cool if possible by storing it in a cellar or shaded location. Some families would bury water jugs partially in the ground to keep them slightly cooler. But here's where it gets complicated. Medical science at the time was genuinely confused about water consumption. Some doctors warned against drinking too much water, claiming that it could weaken the body or disturb the balance of humours. Others recommended drinking very little, claiming that thirst was often psychological rather than physical. This contradictory medical advice meant that different families followed different protocols. Some encouraged drinking water freely and constantly. Others rationed it, believing that moderation was healthier. The quality of water was another massive source of anxiety. Families understood, not perfectly but adequately, that water could carry disease. They didn't understand germ theory, but they knew from observation that people who drank contaminated water got sick. So families with resources would take precautions. They'd keep their water covered, use wooden or ceramic vessels rather than metal ones, which they believed could corrupt the water, and sometimes boil water before drinking it. The boiling was originally thought to cleanse the water of bad air, miasma, but had the beneficial side effect of actually killing pathogens. Here's a quirky historical detail. Some families would add substances to water to allegedly make it safer or better for the body. Alcohol was common. A small amount of spirits added to water could improve its taste and supposedly aid digestion. Some families would add vinegar, honey, or herbs. These additions sometimes helped and sometimes didn't, but they made people feel like they were taking active steps to manage their health. The maintenance of wells required real effort and knowledge. A family's well needed to be regularly cleaned, which meant periodic draining and removal of debris. The surrounding area needed to be kept clean and elevated to prevent surface water and contamination from seeping in. Some families became incredibly invested in their well maintenance, understanding that it was literally a matter of life and death. There was also the problem of water scarcity during dry years. If you were living through a drought, access to water became genuinely dangerous. Wells could run dry. Springs could reduce to a trickle. In these situations, families would have to go further and further to find water, or they'd have to depend on the charity of neighbours with better water access. During severe droughts, this could become a serious survival issue. Historians still argue about whether waterborne diseases like cholera were actually spreading through water supplies in the 1800s, or whether there were other factors at play. What we know is that cholera epidemics definitely corresponded with summer heat and population concentration in cities, and that cholera spread through certain neighbourhoods in patterns that suggest water contamination. By the 1880s, some cities were beginning to develop water systems designed to bring cleaner water from sources further away, but this was still exceptional technology. For families without well access, water carriers became essential during summer. These workers would carry water from public wells or springs to homes, delivering it in buckets or larger containers. They'd charge by the bucket, which meant that poor families often couldn't afford as much water as they might have wanted. Water carriers had interesting status. They were essential workers, but also somewhat looked down upon, carrying water in all weather and earning minimal wages. Some families developed interesting strategies for extending their water supplies during summer. They'd collect rainwater in barrels, which required planning and preparation, but could provide some relief during dry periods. They'd be extremely conservative with water use for everything, except drinking and cooking. Laundry would wait for better weather, bathing would be minimal, and cleaning would be done with far less water than seemed reasonable. The temperature of water mattered too. Families understood that cold water was both more refreshing and better for working bodies during heat. So water would be kept in the coolest available location, a cellar, underground, or in the shade. Some families would draw water in the cool early morning and keep it as cool as possible throughout the day. Cold water wasn't a luxury, it was functionally important for managing heat stress. By the end of the 19th century, as water systems began to be formalised and improved in cities, access to reliable, cleaner water became somewhat more standardised. But for most of the 1800s, water was something you thought about constantly. Its availability determined where you could live, how much work you could do, and how serious your risks were during heat waves. Water was life, and in summer, the fight to access and preserve clean water was one of the most fundamental challenges families faced. Now we get to something that would feel absolutely bizarre to modern people. Families inverted their entire daily schedule during summer. You slept during the day and lived during the night. Your work happened in darkness. Your social life happened after sunset. Even dinner moved to 9 or 10 o'clock at night. If you've ever experimented with shifting your sleep schedule, imagine doing that, not by choice, but because daylight hours were literally unbearable. The heat peaked in the mid-afternoon, usually between 2 and 5 o'clock. During these hours, almost all outdoor work would stop completely. Even working people, servants, labourers, everyone understood that working in direct sunlight during peak heat was dangerous. So the protocol was to work early in the morning, usually starting at dawn or even before, accomplishing as much as possible before the heat became unbearable. Then, as the temperature climbed, people would retreat indoors. The afternoon became a rest period. This wasn't a luxury, it was survival. Families would try to sleep or at least rest in the coolest available space. Children would be put down for naps in the cellar or in shaded rooms. Adults would sit quietly, trying to conserve energy and keep their body temperature down. The heat would make the house dimly lit. Families would close shutters and curtains to keep sunlight out, which meant the interior became almost twilight-like. This darkness, while necessary for keeping the heat down, would actually facilitate sleep. And for people living in the countryside or with minimal work obligations, this rest period could last several hours. For people in cities with jobs or businesses, it was shorter, maybe an hour or two. But the principle was the same. You didn't do strenuous activity during peak heat. As the sun began to descend and the temperature started to drop, activity would resume. This was your second work period of the day. Families would get back to chores, work, tasks that had been postponed from the morning. Merchants would do business, tradespeople would work, farmers would work in the fields. This evening work period could last 2 to 3 hours, from roughly 5 or 6 until dark. But here's where it gets really interesting. After dark, the day didn't end. Instead, it transformed. After sunset and into the evening, a second nighttime period would begin, and this was often more active than the morning or afternoon work periods. This was when social life happened. Neighbours would visit each other, gathering on front porches or in yards to take advantage of the cooler air. Families would sit outside, talking and passing the evening. Young people would use this time for courtship, walking together in the cooling darkness, stealing moments away from family observation. In towns, people might gather at public spaces, creating informal social scenes that developed spontaneously each evening. Businesses would actually open later in the day and stay open into the evening. Street vendors would set up their carts and sell food and goods. People would shop and conduct business in the cooler evening hours instead of during the day. By the 1880s, with the advent of gaslighting and later electric lights in cities, evening activities became even more expansive. You could actually have full economic activity happening late into the night. And then there was the eating. The main meal of the day, which in our era would be lunch, would happen in the morning. A lighter meal might happen in the afternoon. But dinner, the main substantial meal, would often be served very late, sometimes at 9 or 10 o'clock at night. This was partly because it was cooler then, which made both cooking and eating more comfortable. But it was also partly because eating a heavy meal when you're heat-stressed and exhausted from a hot day would make you feel terrible. Some families would eat cold meals during the day, bread, cheese, perhaps some cold meat if they had it. These could be eaten quickly without the heat of cooking, and they wouldn't sit heavy in a heat-stressed stomach. Then, once the sun was down and the temperature had dropped, they'd prepare a hot meal and eat it in relative comfort. Sleep patterns changed radically. Many families would sleep outside during summer, on porches, on specially constructed platforms, or even in the yard. This wasn't because they wanted to. It was because sleeping indoors, even with windows open, was often unbearably hot. By sleeping outside, you at least got whatever breeze was available, and your body could release heat more easily without walls confining it. But sleeping outside came with its own challenges. You were exposed to insects, mosquitoes particularly, which could carry malaria and dengue fever. You were exposed to dew, which would soak you by morning. You were vulnerable to weather changes. A sudden thunderstorm would send you scrambling inside. But compared to sleeping indoors in 100-degree heat, these problems seemed acceptable. Some families developed quite sophisticated outdoor sleeping arrangements. They construct covered platforms or build sleeping structures with roofs but open sides, providing shelter from rain and sun but allowing maximum air circulation. These weren't tents. They were more like permanent or semi-permanent outdoor bedrooms. In some areas and times, having a sleeping porch or sleeping platform became standard architectural features. This inverted schedule meant that families were adapted to what we might think of as night shifts, but they'd been working this way for generations. Children were born into it. Schools would adjust their schedules for summer. Lessons might happen in the early morning and late afternoon, with a long break during the hottest hours. Some schools would actually close during the worst summer months, resuming again in autumn. The psychological effect of this was significant. Living on an inverted schedule meant that your entire sense of time and social rhythm changed seasonally. Summer wasn't just hotter, it was a fundamentally different season in terms of how you organised your day. Modern people sometimes talk about enjoying sleeping in during summer, but for 1800s, families, this wasn't a preference, it was a necessity, and it reshaped everything about how they experienced the world. The architecture of homes changed dramatically to accommodate the heat. Porches, verandas, and sleeping platforms weren't just nice additions to a house. They were often essential survival features. Houses in the 1800s, particularly in hot climates, were designed with the understanding that summer cooling was as important as winter heating. The porch was the most common solution. A deep porch, extending at least 10 feet or more from the house, would provide shade not just for the space under it, but also for the windows behind it. This meant that the direct sun's heat wouldn't penetrate into the main rooms of the house. Porches were also where much of the family's life would happen during summer. Eating meals on the porch, working there, socialising there, the porch became almost a room extension during hot months. Different regions developed different porch styles. In the deep south, you'd see wraparound porches that extended on multiple sides of the house, and often two-storey porches that provided shade at multiple levels. These weren't decorative, they were functional. A house with good porch coverage could stay significantly cooler than one without. Wealthy families understood this and built accordingly. By the mid-1800s, a house without an adequate porch was considered inadequately designed. Verandas, which were more formal and elaborate versions of porches, served similar purposes. They were sometimes screened, providing not just shade but also protection from insects. A screened veranda was the next best thing to air conditioning. You got outside air and light, but without mosquitoes and flies. In regions where malaria was common, a screened veranda could be genuinely life-saving. But beyond the porch, the whole design of the house changed for heat accommodation. Ceilings were higher than in modern homes, often 12 to 14 feet or even higher. This created room for heat to rise and accumulate near the ceiling, keeping it away from where people were actually standing and sitting. Hallways were often designed to facilitate airflow. Windows were placed to create cross-ventilation patterns. Some sophisticated houses even had windows cut through walls specifically to create air channels. A window on one side of the house aligned with a window on the opposite side would create a draft that could move air through multiple rooms. Families would position these windows carefully and use the flow of air strategically. On hot nights, you might open specific windows to direct cool air toward bedrooms. During the day, you might close those windows to keep cool air in and hot air out. The materials of construction mattered enormously. Brick houses, while more expensive to build, actually stayed cooler than wooden houses because brick has thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. A brick house in a hot climate would be noticeably cooler than a wooden house right next door. This meant that wealthy people in hot regions often lived in brick houses, while working people lived in wooden ones. The result was that the wealthy were literally cooler than the poor. Now here's the quirky part that most people don't realise. Sleeping porches were actually common architectural features by the late 1800s. These weren't just platforms, they were actual rooms with permanent structures, sometimes with screens, sometimes with retractable canvas roofs. They'd be attached to the house, often accessible from a bedroom, but open to the outside air. Families would sleep there during summer, getting the benefit of outdoor air and breeze without being completely exposed to weather and insects. Some ingenious house designs incorporated sleeping chambers at the end of porches or in towers that extended from the main structure. These would be deliberately positioned to catch prevailing breezes. By the 1880s, upper-class house design in hot climates would specifically include these structures, recognizing them as essential to livability during summer. The roof was another crucial element. Light-coloured roofs reflected heat rather than absorbing it, which would help keep the interior cooler. Some houses would be designed with roofs that extended far enough to create shade all around the building. Cupolas, small towers built on the roof, would help with ventilation, allowing hot air to rise and escape. Shutters were windows covering structures that served multiple purposes. During the day, closed shutters would keep direct sunlight out of the house, while still allowing some air circulation. They could be adjusted to allow specific amounts of light and air. At night, they'd be open to allow cooler air to enter. In some designs, shutters could be fully removed during summer, enlarging window openings. In other designs, they were temporary structures that could be taken off and replaced with screens or lighter lattice work that provided shade while allowing visibility. Interior design adapted to heat as well. Heavy furniture wasn't practical in hot climates because it trapped heat. Lighter furniture arrangements were preferred. Some wealthy families would actually have separate summer and winter furnishings, storing heavy upholstered furniture during hot months and bringing out lighter pieces. The walls were sometimes painted lighter colours to reflect light and heat rather than absorb it. Stairwells were designed to facilitate air movement. Spiral staircases or open designs would allow hot air to rise and escape, rather than accumulating in a confined space. Some houses had interior atriums or courtyards, open spaces that would be in the hottest part of the day but could provide shade and air circulation in the evening. The kitchen, the room that generated the most heat, would often be detached from the main house or positioned at a distance so its heat wouldn't radiate into living spaces. Some houses had separate summer kitchens, smaller structures that would be used only in hot months, leaving the main kitchen empty and less of a heat source. By the late 1800s, as understanding of physics and thermodynamics improved, house design became more sophisticated. Architects would actually calculate and design houses specifically for climate control. These weren't air-conditioned houses, but they were carefully designed to move air, manage heat, and stay as cool as possible through strategic use of architecture. None of these features were quick fixes. A house with good design could be significantly cooler, maybe 15 to 20 degrees cooler on a hot day, than a poorly designed house. But you were still hot. You were still uncomfortable. You were just less miserable than you might otherwise have been. The garden and orchard represented something crucial during the long hot summers: food security. But the growing season in the heat created unique challenges. Families had to plan what they'd grow, when they'd grow it, and how they'd preserve it, all with the understanding that peak heat would either kill their crops or send them into dormancy. Spring and early summer crops, peas, beans, lettuce, early greens, would mature and be harvested before the peak heat arrived. These would be preserved through various methods: canning, drying, pickling, or storing in the cool cellar. The goal was to get as much nutrition as possible from the early season before the heat made gardening difficult. As the temperature climbed in midsummer, most plants would struggle. Lettuce would bolt and become bitter. Delicate plants would wilt despite watering. Instead of trying to grow cool weather crops in extreme heat, families would focus on heat-tolerant plants: okra, which thrived in heat; melons and squashes, which actually required warmth to produce; beans that could tolerate heat; corn, if you had space, which would produce well in summer heat. This meant that summer gardens looked completely different from spring gardens. It wasn't a continuous parade of fresh vegetables, it was a specific set of plants that actually wanted the heat. Families understood this and worked with it rather than against it. Watering became a serious project during summer. Most gardens were watered by hand, which meant someone, usually a child or woman of the house, had to carry water from the well and apply it to plants. During extreme heat, this watering might need to happen twice daily. In regions with limited water supplies, irrigation choices were crucial. Some families would focus their watering on the crops that would produce the best return, those that would feed the family through winter. Here's a quirky detail. Some families would create shade structures for their gardens to manage heat. Cloth or woven structures might be built over sensitive plants to reduce direct sun exposure during the most intense afternoon heat. These shade structures might have openings to allow air circulation. It was a balance between protection and airflow. Mulching, covering the soil around plants with organic material, was used to keep soil cooler and retain moisture. Families would use straw, leaves, grass clippings, or whatever organic material was available. This simple technique could significantly improve plant survival during heat stress and reduce the amount of watering needed. Orchards were slightly different from gardens. Fruit trees were longer-term investments. You'd plant them and they'd produce for decades, but they also faced challenges in extreme heat. Some trees would actually produce better with some heat stress. Peaches and apricots actually needed hot summers to develop properly, but other trees could suffer. Cherry trees, for instance, were sensitive to excessive heat. Orchards also required planning for summer maintenance. Pruning would be done in early spring or late fall, not during summer when the plants would be stressed. Watering would be essential if there was no rainfall. Pest management, keeping insects and animals from destroying the ripening fruit, was a constant concern, and pest populations would explode in the heat. The late summer and early fall harvest was crucial. As heat began to diminish and fall approached, the next round of crops would start becoming available. Fall vegetables, squash, root vegetables, cabbage, would be planted in mid to late summer and would grow as the temperatures began to drop. These crops would often be the most abundant because they'd mature in the most favourable temperatures and could be preserved to last through winter. Root vegetables, turnips, beets, carrots, parsnips, stored well in the cool cellar and would represent a significant portion of winter food for most families. The abundance of these crops in fall meant that late summer and early fall were desperately busy times. Everything would be harvested at once, and everything would need to be preserved at once. The work was exhausting, but it was necessary. Historians still argue about how much of the average family's caloric intake came from their own gardens versus food they purchased. What we know is that families with gardens had a significant advantage in food security. Even a small garden could produce important nutritional supplements to a grain-heavy diet. A larger garden or orchard could mean the difference between having enough food through winter and not having enough. Families without land, urban poor, landless labourers, had no gardens. They depended entirely on purchased food, which was more expensive and less reliable. When poor urban families experienced hunger, it was often in winter, when stored food supplies had run out and spring gardens hadn't yet produced. The ability to produce your own food was literally a survival advantage. Some families would trade or barter their excess produce with neighbours. A family with excess apples might trade them for excess root vegetables from another family's garden. The orchard owner might trade fruit for grain from a farmer. These informal economies of sharing made communities more resilient. Preservation methods were critical. Drying fruit in the sun was free. You just spread it out and let the heat do the work. Canning required salt, vinegar, sugar, or specialised equipment. Fermenting vegetables required salt and time. Different preservation methods required different resources, and families would choose methods based on what they had available. The quality of the harvest could vary enormously based on weather. A drought summer would reduce yields. A particularly hot summer might kill sensitive crops. Families would experience booms and busts of food production based on weather patterns. This unpredictability meant that families had to store food aggressively. When you had a good harvest, you couldn't assume next year would be as good. By the late 1800s, improved canning technologies and the development of commercial food production began to reduce the importance of home gardens for survival. But throughout the 1800s, the garden was life. Your survival through winter depended on what you could grow and preserve through summer heat, and that reality shaped everything about how families interacted with their land, their plants, and their season. Now we need to address something uncomfortable but historically important: how heat exposure and the work required to manage it was deeply connected to systems of inequality. Servants and enslaved people, didn't get the luxury of resting in cellars during peak heat. They were often the ones doing the work necessary to keep wealthier people cool and comfortable. In the antebellum South, enslaved people worked in fields during the hottest parts of the day. They'd be in the cotton fields, tobacco fields, sugarcane fields, exposed to direct sun, doing physically exhausting work with minimal water and no shade. Heat-related illness and death among enslaved labourers was expected and essentially accepted as part of the cost of doing business. Planters understood that some workers would die in the summer heat. They calculated it into their labour projections. It was genocide wrapped in economics. Even after enslaved people were freed, the inheritance of these inequalities persisted. Black workers and other workers of colour would still be expected to do the most dangerous and heat-exposed work. They'd labour in fields, on railroads, in quarries, in the hottest, most dangerous conditions. Meanwhile, wealthy white families would rest in their cool homes, moving between their northern summer estates and southern winter properties. In northern cities, servants and tenement residents experienced radically different heat than their employers. A servant living in the attic of a wealthy household would be hotter than the family on the main floor, heat rises, and the attic of a house could reach temperatures of 110 or higher, while the cellar where the wealthy family might shelter was a cool 55 degrees. The servant would work all day in that heat, serving the family while the family rested in the cool. Working-class housing in cities, tenements, were architectural nightmares in terms of heat management. These buildings were densely packed, often with minimal ventilation. Windows were small. Interior rooms had no windows at all. A tenement building could become essentially a furnace in summer, with temperatures remaining in the high 90s through the night. Families crammed into small apartments, sometimes multiple families sharing a single apartment, had no escape from the heat. The infant and child mortality rates in poor urban neighbourhoods during summer were staggering. Cholera and dysentery, spread partly through contaminated water and partly through heat-related food spoilage, would kill dozens of children in a neighbourhood during a bad summer. The poorest families would lose multiple children in a single week. This wasn't unfortunate, it was predictable and expected. Wealthy families might lose one child to disease. Poor families would lose 3 or 4. Here's a grim, quirky detail. Funeral businesses had peak seasons. Summer was when they were busiest, particularly in poor neighbourhoods. Child coffins were kept in stock because they'd be needed regularly. The massive preventable mortality of poor children during summer was just accepted as normal. Work schedules for servants and working-class people were brutal during summer. A servant in a wealthy household would be expected to do heavy work, cooking, laundry, cleaning, during the coolest parts of the day, which meant starting before dawn and working into the heat. They might get a rest period, but not in a cool cellar. They'd be in their small room in the attic, trying not to move and trying not to think about the heat. They'd resume work in the evening. Some wealthy families would actually work their servants harder during summer because the family was less active. Instead of the servant accompanying the family on outings, they'd be needed to manage the house, prepare food, maintain it. The servant's schedule would potentially be even more brutal than in other seasons. Enslaved people's situation in the South was even worse. Fieldwork continued in the heat, and the understanding was that workers would endure it. There was essentially no expectation of comfort. The heat wasn't treated as something to adapt to or manage. It was treated as a condition that workers simply had to survive. Workers who couldn't survive it were simply replaced. Even mechanics, tradespeople, and other workers had it difficult. A blacksmith working over a forge during a hot day would be working in temperatures exceeding 120 or 30 degrees. The forge provided heat, and the outdoor or poorly ventilated workshop would be impossibly hot. Yet the work continued. Metal had to be worked, whether or not it was comfortable. Construction work during summer was brutal. Workers labouring under the sun to build homes, churches, and public buildings would do so in extreme heat with minimal rest and limited water. The work had to be done regardless of conditions. Deaths from heat stroke weren't rare. They were occasional but accepted occurrences. Historians still argue about how much class-based differential in heat exposure contributed to wealth disparities and health disparities that persist today. What's undeniable is that in the 1800s, the ability to avoid heat was directly correlated with wealth and social status. This wasn't an accident, it was a structural feature of society. By the late 1800s, as heat-related illness became more medically understood, and as labour movements began demanding better conditions, there was increased recognition that working people shouldn't have to labour in extreme heat. Some cities began passing regulations limiting working hours during heat waves. Some employers began providing water or shade for workers. But these protections came slowly and unevenly. The fundamental reality was that summer heat was an existential challenge for the poor and enslaved, while for the wealthy it was an inconvenience that could largely be managed. This inequality in heat exposure reinforced economic inequality. Poor people had less energy because they were dealing with constant heat stress. They earned less, partly because they weren't as productive when overheated. Their children were more likely to die. The wealthy benefited from the labour of the poor while being isolated from the conditions under which that labour was performed. Heat wasn't just a physical challenge in 1800s America. It was a social institution that reinforced power hierarchies and economic inequalities. Understanding survival through heat requires understanding that not everyone was trying to survive it equally. Some people were managing their own comfort. Others were managing the comfort of others while suffering themselves. When heat became dangerous, when bodies started to fail, families faced challenges that modern medicine would easily address, but for which they had only folk knowledge, and increasingly by the late 1800s developing medical understanding. Heat illness took multiple forms, and families had to recognise the symptoms and respond appropriately. Heat exhaustion and heat stroke weren't always distinguished clearly. What people called sunstroke could be what we'd now classify as either exhaustion or stroke, and the distinction mattered because the treatment was different. Heat exhaustion involved weakness, dizziness, nausea, and profuse sweating. The body was still trying to cool itself, which was better than the alternative. Heat stroke, which was more serious, involved cessation of sweating, delirium, and potential loss of consciousness. The body had essentially given up on cooling itself, and the person was in genuine danger of dying. Folk wisdom about heat illness varied. Some people believed that you shouldn't drink too much water when overheated because it would shock the system. Others believed the opposite, that you needed to drink heavily. Some believed you should be moved to a cool place as quickly as possible. Others thought you should cool gradually to avoid damaging shock. Some of these approaches were helpful, some were harmful. One interesting treatment involved vigorous cooling, cold water or even ice being applied to the body. This could bring down body temperature quickly, which was necessary if someone was experiencing heat stroke. But if done too rapidly or too aggressively, it could cause other problems. The delicate balance between cooling someone who was dangerously overheated without shocking their system was something that required judgment and experience. Some doctors by the late 1800s were beginning to understand heat illness more scientifically. They recognized that keeping someone in a cool environment, providing fluids, and preventing exertion were the key interventions. But this knowledge took time to spread, and folk remedies persisted. Some families would rely on bloodletting, believing that removing bad blood could help. Others would apply poultices or other external treatments. The recognition of heat-related illness often came too late. Someone would be working in the heat, start to feel confused or weak, and be brought inside. By then, they might already be severely heat-stressed. In some cases, the damage had already been done. People could die from heat stroke even if they were cooled and cared for afterward. Children were particularly vulnerable. An infant or toddler couldn't tell you they were overheated. They might simply become lethargic or fussy, and parents might not realise that heat stress was the problem. Some children would develop fever-like symptoms from heat exhaustion, leading parents to treat them for illness rather than recognising that heat itself was the problem. Elderly people were vulnerable for different reasons. Their bodies couldn't regulate temperature as effectively. They might not feel thirst, which meant they wouldn't drink enough water. They might have underlying health conditions that heat stress would exacerbate. Elderly people had high mortality rates during heat waves, particularly if they were alone or not actively monitored. Here's a quirky detail. Some people believed that certain body constitutions were naturally more susceptible to heat illness. So-called nervous people, people with refined constitutions, or people who weren't accustomed to heat were thought to be at higher risk. This belief had some truth. People who were more anxious might experience symptoms more intensely, but it was based on outdated humoral medicine rather than understanding physiology. Some families developed preventive strategies. They'd make sure vulnerable people, children, elderly, people with known sensitivities, were in cool places during peak heat. They'd ensure these people drank water regularly even if they weren't thirsty. They'd watch for early signs of heat illness so they could intervene before it became dangerous. Medical treatments in the late 1800s began to include electric fans in hospital settings. A fan directed towards someone with heat stroke could help with evaporative cooling. Some hospitals actually had ice chambers, rooms kept cool by ice blocks, where heat stroke patients could be placed. These were luxury treatments available only to the wealthy or to patients in major city hospitals. Most families, though, had to manage with what they had: cool water, cool places, rest, and time. If someone was delirious from heat stroke, you'd bring them to the coolest place available, the cellar hopefully, and keep them there until their mind cleared. If they recovered, they'd be left weak and recovering for days. If they didn't recover, they might die. The understanding of death from heat was grim. It was recognised that people could literally die from being too hot, but the mechanism wasn't well understood. Medical science understood that the body couldn't survive at certain temperatures, but they couldn't precisely explain why or how to prevent it, beyond the obvious advice to get cool and drink water. By the 1890s, medical journals were publishing observations about heat-related illness in different populations and climates. Doctors were beginning to understand that acclimatization was real, that people's bodies adapted to heat over time, which meant that people who moved from cool climates to hot ones were at higher risk for heat illness initially. This understanding, while not preventing heat deaths, at least gave doctors better frameworks for advising patients. But for most of the 1800s, heat illness was something families faced with a combination of folk remedies, practical interventions, and prayer. You got someone into the shade and cool place. You gave them water and you hoped. If they lived, you gave thanks. If they died, it was God's will. It wasn't fair or adequate, but it was what people had. Children and elderly people, the most vulnerable members of the population, faced specific, sometimes terrifying challenges during summer heat. Their mortality during summer months was shockingly high by modern standards, but it was simply accepted as a fact of life. Infants and very young children were most at risk. Babies under age 3 couldn't regulate their body temperature effectively. They depended entirely on their caregivers to keep them cool, keep them hydrated, and recognise signs of heat stress. An infant could develop severe heat stress in an hour in direct sun or in an overheated room. They couldn't tell you they were overheated beyond crying, which could be mistaken for hunger or discomfort. Summer diarrhea killed infants at terrifying rates. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Infants would become dehydrated rapidly, and modern IV fluids didn't exist. A family could watch their infant die of dehydration in the course of days with nothing to prevent it. The cholera and dysentery epidemics of summer particularly targeted young children. In some poor neighbourhoods, infant mortality might double or triple in summer months. Mothers would do everything they could to protect their children. They'd keep them indoors in shade, move them between cool locations, minimise their exertion. Some mothers would limit their own activity to avoid generating heat near their children. They'd be terrified on hot days, knowing that their child was at risk. The loss of children to heat-related disease was so common that it shaped family expectations. Parents would have more children than they hoped to keep, because some would likely die in childhood. Infant death became a normal part of life. A typical family might lose 2 or 3 children in a lifetime, and summer heat was a significant cause of those losses. The emotional toll of this constant vulnerability was significant, but it was something families learned to live with or go mad trying. Elderly people faced different challenges. Their bodies had lost some capacity to regulate temperature. They might have chronic health conditions that heat would stress. They might be taking medications that interfered with heat regulation. They were often less mobile, which meant they couldn't easily move to cooler locations. And they had less physiological reserve. If they became overheated, their recovery was slower and more difficult. Heat waves would generate spikes in elderly mortality. An elderly person who was stable and healthy on a 90-degree day might die on a 110-degree day. The stress on their cardiovascular system from trying to maintain normal body temperature in extreme heat could be fatal. Some families had protocols for protecting elderly members. They'd ensure an elderly parent or grandparent spent peak heat hours in the cellar or in the coolest room. They'd bring meals to them so they didn't have to move around unnecessarily. They'd make sure they drank water regularly. But not all families had the resources or attention to provide this level of care. Mortality statistics from the period show clear patterns. Summer deaths spiked, particularly among the very young and the very old. The middle-aged and young adults had better survival rates. This created a population pattern where summer literally shaped the age distribution of living people. more middle-aged and young adult survivors, fewer elderly and young children. Here's a grim, quirky detail. Children who survived multiple summers without serious heat illness were considered particularly hardy or fortunate. Parents would track their children's ability to tolerate heat as a marker of their overall robustness. A child who had never suffered serious heat illness by age 10 was considered likely to have good adult health prospects. The implicit understanding was that some children would succumb to heat, and those who didn't were the lucky or strong ones. Some families developed specific strategies for protecting children. Cold water baths became more acceptable as temperatures rose, despite the general belief that bathing was risky. The risk of heat illness apparently outweighed the risk of cold water. Wet clothing, damping down children's clothes to evaporate and cool them, was a common strategy. Some families would keep children nearly naked during peak heat, despite the cultural discomfort with this. Sleeping arrangements for children changed during summer. Instead of sleeping in a room with other family members, children might sleep outdoors or in specific cool locations. The goal was to keep them as cool as possible during sleep so they'd recover from the heat of the day. Nutrition for children was carefully managed. Lighter foods that wouldn't stress the digestive system during heat were preferred. Some families would give children more water-rich foods, fruits, soups, broths. Breastfed infants had some advantage because breast milk was relatively easy to digest and provided hydration, but weaned children dependent on solid food were at greater risk. Historians still argue about whether summer mortality among children actually decreased over the course of the 1800s as medical knowledge improved and living conditions became slightly better, or whether it remained essentially constant. What's clear is that children's summer vulnerability was a consistent challenge throughout the period. By the late 1800s, there was increasing awareness that summer heat was specifically dangerous for children, and public health officials began making recommendations about keeping children cool, hydrated, and protected from direct sun. These recommendations came too slowly to help most of the 1800s population, but they represent growing recognition of the problem. For the families living through it, summer with children was terrifying. You watched your child constantly for signs of heat illness. You managed their every activity, trying to balance their need for nutrition and growth with the risk of heat stress. You prayed they'd survive to adulthood, and if they didn't, you grieved deeply, but also understood that you'd simply experienced what millions of other families experienced. Summer was dangerous, and children were particularly vulnerable. Urban heat islands, the phenomenon where cities become noticeably hotter than surrounding rural areas, were vividly real in the 1800s, even without the air conditioning and asphalt that make modern cities heat islands. Families in cities suffered more from heat than families in the countryside, and the reasons were complex and structural. Cities in summer were furnaces. Buildings made of brick and stone absorbed heat all day and released it all night, keeping nighttime temperatures well above what they'd be in rural areas. The density of buildings meant that there were fewer open spaces where air could circulate. Streets were packed with people, animals, and activities, all generating heat. Sewage and garbage in the streets decomposed in the heat, creating smells and disease-carrying insects. A city in the 1800s in summer was genuinely unpleasant in ways that modern air-conditioned cities have largely eliminated. The wealthy in cities understood this. By the mid-1800s, wealthy families in hot cities would often leave for the summer, heading to cooler climates. New York's wealthy would head to Newport, Rhode Island, or the Catskills. Wealthy Southerners would head north, away from the worst heat. This seasonal migration was a marker of wealth. Being able to afford to travel multiple times a year for climate was a genuine luxury. Those who remained in cities, the poor and working class, were trapped in conditions that were genuinely dangerous. Tenement buildings in dense urban neighborhoods could be unbearably hot. A 5-story tenement building packed with poor families might have hundreds of people in it, all generating heat, all suffering in inadequately ventilated spaces. The mortality from heat and heat-related disease in cities was shocking. Cholera epidemics in cities like New York in the 1830s killed thousands, many of them in poor neighborhoods. The heat contributed to these epidemics in multiple ways. It accelerated the growth of cholera bacteria in water supplies, it increased the probability of contamination, and it made people more vulnerable to serious disease if exposed. Air quality in cities was often worse than air quality in rural areas. Smoke from fires, from industry, from cooking in dense buildings created a haze that would trap heat and make the atmosphere even more oppressive. On particularly bad days, visibility might be reduced, and the smell of smoke and cooking and human waste would be overwhelming. Open water in cities, rivers and harbours, were often pollution sources rather than cooling sources. While these bodies of water could in theory provide cooling, they were often so contaminated that using them was risky. People living near rivers that ran black with industrial waste couldn't necessarily use them for cooling or drinking. The difference in heat between wealthy and poor neighbourhoods in the same city was dramatic. A poor neighbourhood in the Lower East Side of New York might regularly reach 105 degrees, while a wealthier neighbourhood with more space, more trees, and better ventilation might be 90 degrees. That 15-degree difference could be the difference between surviving summer and dying from heat-related illness. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the priorities of the era. Some city planners in the late 1800s proposed planting more trees in cities specifically as a heat mitigation strategy. Parks and tree-lined streets would provide shade and allow for better air circulation. Some cities did expand parks and plant more trees, partially for aesthetic reasons, but also partly because people understood that shade meant cooler cities. However, the reality was that poor neighbourhoods got fewer trees and less park space, so the heat mitigation benefits primarily went to wealthier areas. Urban gardening was challenging in cities. Small vegetable gardens that might be possible in suburban areas or rural locations weren't feasible in dense urban neighbourhoods. This meant urban families depended entirely on purchased food, which was more expensive and less fresh in summer. An apple from a tree could have been picked that morning. An apple purchased in a city market might have been shipped days ago, picked before it was ripe, and would be of lower quality. For nutrition and for variety, urban families were disadvantaged. Water access in cities was officially somewhat better than in rural areas. Many cities had public water systems by the late 1800s. But these systems were often inadequate during extreme heat, when water demand surged and supplies sometimes ran short. Additionally, water pipes in cities could become contaminated, or could transport water that had grown too warm. Cold water was less available than in rural areas with wells and springs. The development of public baths in some cities in the late 1800s was partly motivated by heat management. Public baths allowed poor people to bathe in cool water and get relief from the heat, at least temporarily. These facilities were initially opposed by some elements of society as supposedly promoting immorality, but they became increasingly accepted as health facilities. Social problems in cities were exacerbated by heat. Crime increased during heat waves, tempers frayed, domestic violence increased. The psychological stress of living in an overheated, overcrowded, foul-smelling urban environment in summer wore on people. Alcohol consumption increased, partly as people sought relief and escape from their circumstances. By the very end of the 1800s, some city planners and reformers were beginning to understand that cities needed to be more livable in summer. They were promoting expanded parks, better ventilation in buildings, and improvements to water systems. But these reforms came slowly, and most 1800s urban poor experienced summer as a period of particular hardship. The contrast between rural and urban summer experiences was stark. A farmer might be working hard during summer heat, but at least they could work in early morning and evening, could find shade, could potentially find relief by going to a cool location. An urban factory worker might work all day in a hot factory, go home to a hot tenement, and have minimal options for cooling. The urban experience of summer heat was qualitatively worse than the rural experience. Now let's talk about the technology that families could afford. Fans, punker systems, and ice fans. These were genuinely clever solutions that worked with the heat, rather than against it, and they could provide meaningful relief even without electricity. The simple hand fan was ubiquitous. Every person, particularly women, would have access to a hand fan. These could be made of paper, cloth, or other materials. They came in elaborate designs and simple designs, but functionally they all worked the same way. You moved air across your body by fanning yourself, which would increase evaporation and provide evaporative cooling. The physical act of fanning yourself could lower your effective temperature by several degrees. Fans served multiple purposes. A woman in a formal setting might fan herself as a gesture that was simultaneously about cooling and about propriety and fashion. A working person would fan themselves out of genuine necessity. A child would fan a family member while sitting quietly, a task that required minimal effort but provided real benefit. But fans extended beyond the personal hand fan. There were larger mechanical fans, manual devices that could move more air than a hand fan. These weren't electric. They had gears and manual cranks or hand-operated levers that would move blades or paddles to create air circulation. A family with such a device would position it strategically and operate it, either continuously or periodically, to move air through their home. The punkah is a genuinely fascinating technology that comes from South Asia, where it had been used for centuries before being adopted in America. A punkah is essentially a large frame with cloth or fine material suspended from it. It hangs from the ceiling or is suspended over a space, and it's pulled back and forth either by hand or by a mechanical system. As it moves back and forth, it creates a breeze in the space below. Some punkah systems were simple, manually operated by someone pulling a rope or lever. Others were more elaborate, using weights or mechanical systems to create rhythmic motion. In the American South, punkah systems became fashionable in wealthier homes by the mid-1800s. A servant would be assigned to operate the punkah, pulling the rope rhythmically to create continuous air movement. This would provide relief during the hottest hours. While this required constant work from the servant, the cost of one servant was actually less than the cost of purchasing ice regularly. So some families preferred punkah systems to ice-based cooling. The ice fan is another clever system. Essentially, you'd place ice in a container above or behind a fan, and as the ice melted, the cooling water would evaporate, or the cold air rising from the ice would be pushed by the fan to create cool air circulation. A fan with ice blocks placed strategically could lower the temperature in a room noticeably. On a 95-degree day, an ice fan might make a room feel like 75 degrees, which is genuinely significant. The challenge with ice fans was that they required a continuous supply of ice, which meant they were expensive. A wealthy family might use them selectively, perhaps in a bedroom at night to allow for better sleep, or in a parlour during evening entertainments. But sustained use would require more ice than most families could afford. Here's a quirky detail. Some families created DIY cooling systems using water and fans. They damp cloth with water and position a fan to blow across the damp cloth, creating evaporative cooling. This required minimal equipment and worked reasonably well. The cooled air would be directed toward where people needed relief, a sleeping area, a work area, or just a gathering space. By the 1880s, mechanical fans, still hand-cranked but with better engineering, became more common. These could be positioned to move substantial amounts of air, providing relief across larger spaces. A hand-cranked fan in a parlour or gathering room during the evening could provide relief to an entire family gathering. The design of fans evolved throughout the century. Early fans were simple but effective. Later fans had multiple blades, better bearings, and more efficient designs. By the 1890s, electric motors were starting to be used to power fans, which meant that continuous air circulation could be maintained without manual labour. But electric fans were still expensive and relatively rare outside of wealthy homes and commercial spaces. Ceiling fans became increasingly popular in the late 1800s. A ceiling fan would create continuous air circulation in a room, potentially making it feel 5 to 10 degrees cooler through evaporative cooling. The first ceiling fans were hand-operated or operated via mechanical systems. By the 1890s, electric ceiling fans were being manufactured, though they were luxury items. The environmental understanding of these fan systems was intuitive rather than scientific. People didn't understand evaporative cooling in scientific terms, but they understood that air movement made them feel cooler. They understood that moving air helped water evaporate, and that evaporation felt cold. They understood that fans could move heat out of a space and fresh, cooler air in. The labour involved in manual fan operation was significant. A servant or family member operating a punkah for hours at a time was doing work that was boring and repetitive. But if it provided relief for elderly or vulnerable family members, or if it made a space bearable enough for sleep, it was considered worthwhile. In some cases, multiple people would take shifts operating a punkah so that no single person was overwhelmed with the monotonous work. By the very end of the 1800s, with electric fans becoming available, the labour-intensive manual cooling systems began to seem outdated. A family could purchase an electric fan for the cost of weeks of ice delivery, and it would provide cooling without ongoing expenses. This transition from manual to electrical systems was gradual, but it represented a fundamental shift in how people approached the problem of summer heat. The architecture of windows and shutters, seemingly simple features, actually represented sophisticated understanding of airflow, heat management, and temperature control. Every element of these systems served a specific function, and families developed intricate knowledge about how to operate them effectively. Windows themselves were the primary way that heat entered or exited a building. During the day, with the sun shining, windows allowed radiant heat to penetrate into living spaces. During the evening and night, windows could be opened to allow cooler outside air in. The challenge was managing which windows were open when and how much. Shutters served multiple purposes. Interior shutters could be closed to reflect light and heat away from windows, keeping the interior cooler. Exterior shutters served similar functions but also could be adjusted to allow partial opening, creating ventilation while blocking direct sunlight. The operation of shutters was a daily protocol. They'd be closed during the day to keep heat out and opened at night to allow cooling air in. This required timing and attention. A family would need to keep track of which side of the house had sun at what time of day. Morning windows on the eastern side would get intense early morning sun. Windows on the western side would get intense afternoon heat. Windows on the northern side might be safer to keep open during the day. Families developed complex mental maps of their homes' sun exposure throughout the day. Some families would develop actual protocols or schedules for shutter operation. A specific person might be assigned the task of opening and closing shutters at designated times. In some cases, the operation would be coordinated, opening all eastern shutters at sunrise, then moving to western shutters as the sun moved across the sky. It sounds complex because it was, but it was also second nature to people living in hot climates. Cross-ventilation was the ultimate goal. If you could create an air path from one window through a room to another window, you could create a draft that would push hot air out and cool air in. This required having windows on opposite sides of the room or house. Some houses were designed specifically to enable cross-ventilation, with window placement that created intentional airflow patterns. The design of hallways was important for ventilation. If hallways allowed air to move through them, they could become channels for air circulation throughout a house. Some homes had interior designs that essentially created wind tunnels, air paths that would funnel cool air from outside into the interior of the home. Window coverings beyond shutters were also used. Heavy curtains could block light and heat, though they'd also block air circulation if they were thick. Some families would hang light cloth or screens on windows to block some light while still allowing air movement. These temporary coverings could be adjusted or removed as needed. Here's a quirky detail. Some people would sleep with their windows open specifically to catch cooling breezes, but they were concerned about the health effects of night air. The belief in bad air, or miasma, meant that some people were hesitant about sleeping with open windows. This created a conflict. You wanted cooling air, but you were worried that the night air itself was unhealthy. Some families would compromise by opening windows partially or opening them after the initial coolest part of the night. Skylights and roof openings served specific functions. Hot air rises, so an opening in the ceiling or roof could allow hot air to escape from the interior. Some houses had cupolas, small towers on the roof, that would allow hot air to rise and escape. These architectural features were genuinely functional for cooling. Awnings were another element of the ventilation and cooling system. An awning over a window would block direct sunlight from entering through that window, while still allowing air circulation. Awnings over porches or windows on the southern and western exposures could significantly reduce heat gain. The seasonal removal and storage of winter coverings was important. Heavy curtains that were appropriate for winter would be removed in summer and stored away. Their insulating properties that were valuable in winter would make rooms hotter in summer. The transition from winter to summer involved systematically changing how windows were covered and operated. By late in the 1800s, some homes had mechanical systems to aid ventilation. Ventilation shafts and ducts built into the structure could direct air movement. These weren't motorized. They relied on natural convection and airflow, but they represented sophisticated understanding of how to move air through a building. The operation of windows and shutters wasn't just about managing temperature. It was also about managing light and darkness. Sleeping required darkness, but heat in bedrooms was uncomfortable. Families had to balance the desire for darkness with the need for air circulation. Some would sleep in completely dark rooms and accept being somewhat hotter, while others would accept some light to gain cooling benefits. Humidity affected how effective ventilation was. In humid climates, open windows would bring in not just cooler air, but also damper air. In dry climates, window ventilation could be very effective. Families understood these regional differences and adjusted their protocols accordingly. The knowledge required to effectively operate a home's windows and shutters was substantial. It required understanding the sun's path throughout the year, understanding prevailing wind patterns, understanding the heat properties of different materials, and understanding how heat moved through structures. This knowledge was accumulated over time and taught to new generations. A person growing up in a hot climate would absorb this knowledge without formal instruction, simply through observation and participation in daily life. Now we shift to something darker, the relationship between summer heat and disease. Heat didn't just cause heat illness, it created conditions where disease flourished. Cholera, dysentery, yellow fever, malaria, and other infectious diseases would spike during summer months, creating epidemics that killed thousands and created absolute terror in affected communities. Cholera is the most famous example. This disease, caused by bacteria in contaminated water, would kill rapidly, literally within hours in some cases. A person would start with diarrhea and vomiting, and within a day or two they might be dead from dehydration. Cholera epidemics in American cities in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s were absolutely devastating. In New York in 1832, more than 3,000 people died in a single cholera epidemic during summer months. That was out of a population of about 300,000. The impact was catastrophic. Cholera's connection to heat was partly direct and partly indirect. The heat allowed cholera bacteria to multiply more rapidly in water. Heat also caused people to drink more water, which increased their exposure. Additionally, heat caused diarrhea in general, which made it difficult to distinguish between cholera and simple, heat-related diarrhea until it became severe. Dysentery, a parasitic infection that also caused severe diarrhea, similarly peaked in summer. It was spread through contaminated food and water, and the heat accelerated spoilage of food, which made contamination more likely. Malaria and dengue fever, transmitted by mosquitoes, also peaked in summer. Mosquito populations exploded in the heat, particularly near stagnant water. Families understood that mosquitoes were associated with summer illness, though they didn't understand the mechanism. They'd avoid areas with mosquitoes, would try to eliminate standing water, and would sometimes use smoke or other methods to drive mosquitoes away. Yellow fever was particularly terrifying. This is another mosquito-borne disease that caused high mortality rates. Yellow fever epidemics in cities like Philadelphia and Memphis in the late 1800s killed thousands. The disease would appear suddenly, kill people rapidly, and create panic as people fled the affected city. The medical understanding of these diseases was improving over the course of the 1800s. By the 1890s, researchers understood that yellow fever was transmitted by mosquitoes. The understanding that cholera spread through contaminated water was developed in the 1850s and 1860s. Malaria's mosquito transmission was understood by the 1890s. But for most of the 1800s, medical explanations were based on miasma theory, the belief that bad air carried disease. Families' responses to disease were shaped by this incomplete understanding. They'd try to avoid bad air, would keep windows closed, would burn certain substances they believed would purify the air. Some of these responses actually helped. Burning materials that smoked might have repelled mosquitoes, for instance, but the reasoning was based on incorrect theories. Quarantine was another response. When cholera appeared in a neighbourhood, families would try to isolate themselves. They'd avoid contact with affected families, wouldn't share water sources, would try to minimise exposure. The reality was that this came too late in most cases. Cholera would spread before anyone understood it was present. Here's a grim, quirky detail. During cholera epidemics, people would try to identify who was sick by looking at them. Severe diarrhea causes dehydration, which gives people a distinctive appearance: sunken eyes, grey skin tone. People who looked like they might have cholera would be avoided like they had the plague. Some areas would try to isolate anyone with diarrhea to prevent spread. Treatment for these diseases was limited. Doctors would recommend rest, fluids, and supportive care. But there was no specific cure. An effective cure for many parasitic and bacterial infections didn't exist, so families essentially watched their loved ones suffer and hoped they'd survive. Mortality rates were often above 50%. You got cholera, you had a coin flip chance of surviving it. Some people survived, others didn't. The psychological impact of epidemic disease was significant. People lived in fear during summer months. Even in regions where disease wasn't currently present, The knowledge that it could appear at any time created anxiety. Families would take precautions against disease, avoiding water they suspected, refusing to visit sick neighbours, quarantining family members who showed symptoms. Public health responses evolved over the century. Early in the 1800s, there were minimal coordinated responses to epidemics. By the end of the century, cities were developing public health departments that would implement quarantines, clean water supplies, and other interventions. These public health measures saved lives, though they came late to help most 1800s populations. The development of germ theory and the understanding of how diseases actually spread was revolutionary. When people finally understood that disease came from bacteria and parasites, not from bad air, the approach to prevention changed. Clean water systems, food safety, mosquito control, these interventions were based on correct understanding of disease transmission. Historians still argue about how much of summer mortality during the 1800s was due to heat illness directly versus disease that was facilitated by heat. Certainly, heat itself killed people, but epidemics of waterborne and insect-borne disease that peaked in summer also killed significant numbers. For families, both were part of the summer danger. You worried about your child getting heat stroke and about them getting cholera. Both were real threats. The summer of 1800s, America was a season of dread for many people, particularly those in cities where epidemic disease was a regular occurrence. The arrival of warm weather meant the arrival of danger. It wasn't until the late 20th century, with modern sanitation, medicine, and understanding of disease, that summer ceased to be associated with epidemics of preventable disease. Bathing and hygiene during summer presented genuine challenges. The relationship between cleanliness, health, and summer was complicated by incomplete medical understanding, cultural taboos, and practical limitations. The conventional wisdom of the era was that bathing, particularly cold bathing, was dangerous. The belief was that cold water could shock the system, particularly if you were already hot, or if your body was not acclimated to cold. Some medical authorities recommended against bathing during summer heat because they believed the thermal shock could cause illness or even death. This meant that many people, particularly those who followed medical advice, would actually bathe less frequently during summer, despite the practical fact that heat and activity made them sweatier. This created obvious hygiene problems. In summer, people would sweat profusely, accumulating salt and bacteria on their skin. Clothing would become saturated with sweat. The combination of sweat, heat, and poor bathing facilities created conditions where skin infections and other problems would flourish. Working-class people often had minimal bathing facilities. A bath would require heating water, which required fuel and time and created more heat in an already hot environment, and finding privacy and a bathing container. For poor families without bathing facilities, bathing might involve going to a stream or river, or using buckets of water drawn from a well. Some people would compromise by using sponge baths or partial bathing. Instead of immersing the entire body in water, they'd use cloth and water to clean specific areas: underarms, face, neck. This would provide some of the benefits of bathing without the full thermal shock. Interestingly, by the late 1800s, as understanding of germ theory improved, the belief that bathing was dangerous began to shift. The understanding that cleanliness actually prevented disease meant that bathing, particularly in summer, began to be recommended rather than discouraged. Public baths became more common, and families began bathing more regularly. The cultural taboos around bathing were particularly restrictive for women. The exposure of the body that bathing required was considered improper. A woman would typically bathe fully clothed, or would bathe in a shift that covered most of her body. The process of undressing for a bath and potentially being seen by another person, even a family member, was considered shocking. This meant that women's personal hygiene was compromised by social expectations. Some elaborate bathing customs developed around these taboos. A woman might bathe in her shift, then carefully dry off and change, never exposing herself. She might have a servant help with bathing, with protocols about keeping eyes averted and maintaining propriety. It was cumbersome and somewhat ridiculous, but it was how things were done. Water temperature was a point of contention. In general, cold water was considered healthier than warm water for bathing, which made sense because warm water would make you feel hotter overall. But cold water was shocking and uncomfortable, particularly for those not acclimated to it. Wealthy people might have servants prepare bath water at specific temperatures, cool but not ice cold, as a compromise. Hair washing was a separate and serious endeavour. Hair washing required substantial amounts of water, took a long time, and created a period where the person was vulnerable and couldn't easily dry off or regulate their temperature. Hair washing was often done weekly or less frequently, and not necessarily in summer. Laundry, the washing of clothes, was another major hygiene undertaking that created challenges in summer. Clothes would get heavily soiled with sweat and dirt. In summer, wet clothes would dry quickly, which was convenient, but the process of laundering, heating water, scrubbing clothes, wringing them out, would generate significant heat. Many families would minimise laundry in summer, reusing clothes longer between washings. The problem of sweat-soaked bedding was significant. Bedding would become saturated with sweat, creating conditions for mould and bacterial growth. Bedding would need to be washed and dried regularly, but the effort required made this difficult. Some families would have multiple sets of bedding specifically so they could launder one set while sleeping on another. Here's a quirky detail. Some people would apply substances to their bodies to manage sweat and heat. Powder made from various materials would be dusted on to absorb sweat. Some people would use oils, paradoxically, believing that they would seal the skin and prevent excessive sweating. Some of these applications were effective. Others made things worse by making skin feel more uncomfortable. The problem of odour was considered important but difficult to address. Body odour in heat was inevitable, and social conventions required that you manage it. Perfumes and other scented materials were used to mask body odour. Changing clothes frequently would help, but washing clothes was laborious. Some people would essentially become accustomed to being somewhat malodorous during summer and accepted it as part of the season. Dental hygiene was complicated by heat. Drinking more water was necessary for survival, which meant more frequent urination and more stress on the system. The diet often shifted in summer to lighter foods, which could affect dental health. But dental problems would be managed without modern dentistry, mainly by extraction, if a tooth became problematic. The feet, constantly sweating and exposed to heat, would develop problems: blisters, fungal infections, swelling. The problem was exacerbated by the leather shoes that people wore. Some relief came from removing shoes when possible and soaking feet in cool water, but the opportunity to do this was limited for people working all day. By the late 1800s, public health campaigns began promoting better hygiene and explaining that cleanliness actually prevented disease. This represented a major shift from the earlier belief that bathing and excessive washing were unhealthy. The new understanding, based on germ theory, meant that summer cleanliness was promoted as health-promoting rather than dangerous. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, summer transformed from a period of isolation and survival into a time of social life and activity. The evening became the real daytime for social interaction, and families and communities would shift their entire social rhythm to fit the heat. Visiting became evening activity. Families would visit neighbours in the evening when it was cooler. These weren't quick transactions, they were social events. An evening visit might last hours, with people sitting together on a porch or in a yard, talking and watching the night cool off. For people isolated by heat during the day, these evening visits were important social connections. Courtship took place in the evening. Young people would promenade, taking walks together in the cooling darkness. A young man might visit a young woman's home in the evening, specifically to have a chance to walk and talk with her. The relative privacy and the cool air made evening courting sessions romantic in ways that daytime interactions couldn't be. In towns, evening commerce would flourish. Street vendors would set up carts selling food, drinks, and goods. Markets that were closed during the hot day would reopen in the evening. People would shop for tomorrow's food and supplies in the cool evening hours. The streets would fill with people, creating a nighttime social scene. Entertainment happened in the evening. If there was a concert, a lecture, a social gathering, or any public event, it would likely happen in the evening. The audiences would be larger because people could actually stay awake and comfortable instead of being overwhelmed by heat. Churches might hold evening services or social gatherings in summer rather than morning services. The tavern or local gathering space would become more active in evening. Men would gather to drink, talk, and socialise. These spaces would be full in the evening and empty during the day. The tavern keeper would do most of their business in the evening when people had recovered from the heat and could enjoy a beer without it making them more uncomfortable. Young people in particular would be out in the evening. The relative freedom of darkness and the excuse of cooling off meant that young people had more opportunity to socialise without direct supervision. Romantic relationships would develop in these evening spaces. Friendships and social bonds would be strengthened through regular evening gathering. The evening ritual had a quality almost of a festival. The arrival of cool air brought relief and revived energy. People would emerge from their hot homes and gather outside, and there was a sense of celebration and release. The heat of the day had been endured. The evening was the reward. Some families would have regular evening routines. They might eat their main meal at 8 or 9 o'clock, after which they'd gather outside to socialise while they waited for it to digest. Children would play outside in the relative cool, with parents watching from porches. The entire family structure was oriented toward evening activity. Here's a quirky detail. Evening visiting etiquette developed specific protocols. You wouldn't arrive too early, not until the worst heat had passed. You wouldn't stay too late. People needed to sleep eventually. But the window of acceptable visiting hours could be substantial. From 7 o'clock until 10 or 11 at night was reasonable for social visiting. Courting couples would develop specific routines. They might arrange to walk a particular route on specific evenings, understanding that they'd encounter each other if they were both walking that direction at that time. The relative anonymity of darkness and the excuse of needing to cool off provided cover for romantic meetings that might not be explicitly approved by families. Social class affected evening activity. Working-class neighbourhoods would be more crowded with evening activity, streets full of people, street vendors, informal gatherings. Wealthier neighbourhoods would be quieter, with evening activity happening on private porches and in private homes. But the principle was the same. Evening was the time for social interaction. The evening carried risk as well. The darkness provided cover for crime and misconduct. There were concerns about young women being out unescorted. Moral concerns about the activity and gatherings happening in the darkness were expressed by authorities. But the practical necessity of managing summer heat meant that evening activity continued regardless of concerns. Insect activity increased in the evening, particularly mosquitoes, which would emerge as the sun set. Smoke from fires would be used to drive them away. Some people would light citronella or other plant materials that were believed to repel insects. The evening relief from heat came with the trade-off of increased insect exposure. The transition from evening coolness to night heat was important. The temperature would drop as the night progressed, reaching its coolest point just before dawn. Many families would stay awake as long as the evening remained pleasant, then sleep during the cooler part of the night. This meant late nights and early mornings. By the late 1800s, with gas lighting and eventually electric lighting becoming available, evening activities could be more illuminated and could extend later. Evening gatherings could be larger and more organised. But the fundamental importance of evening as the active time of the day remained consistent. Animals suffered in the heat just as people did, and their suffering cascaded into food insecurity that affected entire families. A family's survival through winter depended on the health and productivity of their livestock. Dairy cows, chickens, pigs, and summer heat threatened all of it. Dairy cows were particularly vulnerable to heat stress. When temperatures climbed above 90 degrees, many cows would essentially stop producing milk. The stress on their bodies from thermoregulation would redirect their energy away from milk production. A dairy cow that produced 2 gallons a day in spring might produce barely half a gallon in August. This had immediate impacts on the family's nutrition and on the family's income if they sold milk or dairy products. Worse than reduced production was death. Heat stroke affected cattle. A cow that was worked too hard in the heat could collapse and die. Some farmers understood that working animals needed to be rested during peak heat, but other farmers would push through, demanding labour during the hottest hours and accepting some animal loss as a cost of business. Chickens similarly suffered. Egg production would drop as hens experienced heat stress. Brooding, a hen's desire to sit on and incubate eggs, might actually increase in heat, reducing the number of eggs available for eating while the hen focused on nesting. Some chickens would actually die from heat stroke, particularly if they were confined to coops in direct sun. Pigs were somewhat more heat-tolerant than cattle, but still suffered. Pigs would become lethargic in extreme heat, would lose weight, and would be at risk of disease. A pig meant for winter slaughter needed to put on significant weight through summer and fall. Heat stress that prevented weight gain meant a smaller, less valuable animal by the time it was slaughtered. The combination of reduced production, increased mortality, and weight loss in livestock meant that families faced food insecurity that extended beyond summer. The dairy that might have been made in summer would have been preserved for winter consumption. The lack of it would be felt through the cold months. The pig that should have been a source of meat and lard would be less productive. The eggs that should have been preserved would be fewer. Some families developed strategies to manage animal heat stress. They'd provide shade structures, they'd ensure access to water, they'd minimise exertion during peak heat. Wealthy farmers could afford to provide better protection for their animals. Poor farmers often couldn't. The animals would simply have to survive as best they could. The stress of heat on animals sometimes made them more vulnerable to disease. A heat-stressed animal is an animal with a compromised immune system. Summer diseases and parasites would affect animals more severely. Flies and parasites would proliferate in summer, adding additional stress to already stressed animals. Here's a grimly interesting detail. Some farmers understood that their animals couldn't produce in extreme heat, and they'd plan accordingly. The dairy would be produced in spring and early fall, with summer being a period of reduced production that was simply accepted. Families would preserve more aggressively in spring, knowing that summer production would be minimal. Pasture quality affected animal nutrition and health. Good pasture in spring and early summer would allow animals to build up fat reserves. But as summer progressed and heat created drought conditions, pasture would become scarce and poor quality. Animals would struggle to maintain their weight on inadequate grazing. Some families would supplement with hay, saved from the previous year, which created additional labour and resource management challenges. The heat also affected work animals, horses and oxen used for labour. These animals would simply be unable to work during peak heat. A farmer couldn't effectively plough fields or transport goods during the hottest part of the day. The animals would become dangerously overheated. This meant that much of the work that needed to be done had to be done in early morning or evening, or simply wasn't done during peak summer. A horse or ox that died from heat or overwork represented a catastrophic loss. These animals were valuable, irreplaceable assets. A family might lose their farm if they lost their working animals. So farmers were careful. They'd water animals frequently, would give them shade, would minimise work during peak heat. But accidents happened, and animals died. The psychological impact of watching your animals suffer was significant. For many people, their relationship with their animals was intimate and deeply felt. Seeing a cow you'd cared for years dying of heat stress was genuinely traumatic. Some farmers would try to provide comfort, bringing water, providing shade, sitting with a suffering animal. But ultimately the animal would suffer and potentially die. By the late 1800s, some farmers began experimenting with selective breeding for heat tolerance. Certain cattle breeds actually handled heat better than others. As people understood this, breeding decisions began to be made with heat tolerance in mind. But most of the 1800s, families simply worked with whatever animals they had and dealt with heat stress as it came. The connections between animal health, food security and human survival during summer heat were direct and immediate. Poor conditions for animals meant poor conditions for families. A summer that killed livestock was a summer that created food scarcity for the following winter, and when food scarcity hit, it was the poor and vulnerable who suffered most. The contrast between wealthy and working-class summer experiences was absolutely stark. If you had money, summer could be managed and even reasonably comfortable. If you were poor, summer was a season of survival and risk. Wealthy families in hot climates often had multiple homes, specifically for seasonal living. A family might own a large home in the city where they'd live during temperate seasons, and then move to a coastal or mountain home during summer. This seasonal migration meant that the wealthy could simply leave the heat behind. They'd pack up their households, move their most valuable possessions, and spend summer in a cool location with fresh air and comfortable conditions. These seasonal movements were elaborate undertakings. Servants would be sent ahead to prepare the summer home. The family would travel with trunks of seasonal clothing and personal items. Some of the household staff would accompany them. Others would stay behind to maintain the winter home. The cost of maintaining two properties and moving between them was substantial, but for the truly wealthy, it was feasible. Even wealthy families that didn't move seasonally could manage summer more comfortably. They could afford ice regularly, blocks delivered several times a week. They could afford to employ servants to manage the labour of keeping the home cool and managing food preservation. They could afford larger homes with better ventilation. They could afford to be inactive during the day, resting in cool spaces while servants did the work required. Summer clothing for wealthy people reflected their ability to manage heat. Light, expensive fabrics were available and affordable. Men could wear light linen suits, Women could afford expensive light cotton and linen dresses. Children could have multiple sets of clothing so that they'd always have clean, light garments. The food available to wealthy families reflected seasonal advantages. They had access to ice-preserved foods from winter. They could afford fresh foods, fruits and vegetables, that required transportation and wealth to access. They could employ cooks to prepare food in ways that managed heat. Cold dishes prepared carefully in the early morning. Working-class families had almost none of these advantages. They lived in the homes they could afford, which were often poorly ventilated and absorbed heat. They couldn't afford ice. They did the physical labour required to keep their homes functional and to produce their food. They lived in density, multiple families in shared houses or tenement buildings, where privacy and cool spaces were impossible to find. Working-class children in hot cities faced particular vulnerability. They might be confined to hot apartments or crowded tenements all day. They might be working in factories, in street trades, in agricultural labour. They might be exposed to summer diseases in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Their mortality in summer months was multiples higher than wealthy children's. Working-class food was limited. They depended on foods that could be afforded and preserved without ice: grains, dried beans, bread, and limited fresh produce. The nutrition would be less varied and sometimes less adequate. A working-class family might eat the same grain-based meals day after day through summer with limited fresh produce or protein. Here's a starkly unfair detail. Some wealthy families actually profited from working-class suffering. Ice companies and merchants who supplied ice to the wealthy were getting richer as winter ice reserves were sold. Food prices might increase in summer as scarcity drove costs up, which meant that poor families paid more for food while their income might be lower due to reduced work opportunities. The wealthy benefited from economic activity driven by summer heat. Ice sales, increased food prices, demand for servants. The psychological difference was also significant. A wealthy person in summer experienced discomfort that they knew was temporary. They'd soon be in their cool summer home, or the discomfort would end when autumn arrived. A working-class person endured summer heat, with no certainty of relief and no prospect of escape. The hopelessness of enduring unbearable conditions with no break in sight had psychological consequences. Access to water was another major division. Wealthy families with wells on their properties or with resources to buy water had access to necessary hydration. Some poor families in crowded urban areas might have to carry water significant distances or had limited access to clean water. Medical care in summer was another advantage of wealth. A wealthy family experiencing heat illness could call a doctor. The doctor might not have effective treatments, but at least there was professional attention. A poor family would manage with whatever folk remedies they knew, which often weren't adequate. The mortality statistics reflected these differences. In major cities, summer mortality in poor neighbourhoods could be 2 or 3 times higher than in wealthy neighbourhoods. The difference wasn't purely biological, it was structural and economic. Poverty made summer more dangerous. By the end of the 1800s, public health improvements meant that some of these disparities began to decrease. Municipal water systems brought cleaner water to poor neighbourhoods. Public health efforts reduced mortality from cholera and other summer diseases. But throughout most of the 1800s, summer was a season where wealth determined your likelihood of suffering and dying. The fundamental unfairness was that heat, an environmental condition that affected everyone, became weaponized through economics and social structure. Those who could afford to manage it managed it. Those who couldn't suffered. And the system that created this disparity was so normalized that it rarely seemed unjust. This was just how life was. The poor suffered more in summer. That was expected. The psychological effects of prolonged extreme heat weren't well understood in the 1800s, but they were significant. Heat didn't just affect bodies, it affected minds. The constant physical stress of managing temperature could lead to irritability, depression, and in severe cases, actual delirium. Irritability was perhaps the most obvious effect. People living in extreme heat, especially families confined together in small hot spaces, would become short-tempered. Tempers would flare over minor issues. Conflicts that might normally be managed civilly would escalate into arguments. Families would struggle to get along as the stress of constant heat wore on their patience. This heat-induced irritability could have serious consequences. Domestic violence increased during heat waves. People would strike their children or spouses more readily, the cumulative stress of heat lowering their threshold for retaliation. This wasn't recognised as heat-related at the time. It was just seen as people having bad tempers or character flaws. But the correlation between heat and violence was real and significant. Depression was another documented effect. People would experience what we might now recognise as situational depression, a persistent low mood related to the unbearable conditions. This wasn't the kind of depression that would be recognised as illness in the 1800s. It was just seen as people being sad or melancholy. But contemporary accounts describe people becoming withdrawn, losing interest in activities, and experiencing a pervasive sense of hopelessness as summer dragged on. In more severe cases, heat stress could lead to actual delirium. A person suffering from heat stroke or extreme heat exhaustion might become confused, disoriented, and emotionally unstable. A person in this state might do things that were completely out of character, become violent, become withdrawn, make poor decisions. Once they recovered from the physical heat stress, the delirium would often resolve, but while they were in it, they were genuinely not themselves. The combination of physical exhaustion from managing heat, poor sleep from the inability to cool down, and the general stress of summer created a psychological state that predisposed people toward poor mental health. Modern people might recognise this as a kind of burnout, the exhaustion from trying to manage an unsustainable situation. Some people would essentially shut down psychologically during extreme heat. They'd stop engaging in activities, would become passive and withdrawn, would spend hours just sitting in shaded locations trying to conserve energy. This wasn't laziness, it was a psychological response to unbearable conditions. Here's a quirky detail. Alcohol consumption would often increase during heat waves. People would drink to escape their circumstances mentally, to cool down. Alcohol has cooling properties, or to manage their mood. The consumption of alcohol in heat is actually dangerous because alcohol impairs the body's ability to regulate temperature, but the short-term psychological relief made people willing to take the risk. Anxiety about the future was significant. People living through a serious heat wave didn't know if it would break, didn't know if their family would survive the summer. The uncertainty and the lack of control over their circumstances created psychological stress. Some people would engage in magical thinking, performing rituals or prayers in hopes of bringing relief. Children's behaviour would be affected by heat, and the resulting parental irritability. Children confined indoors to stay cool, parented by exhausted and irritable adults, would develop behavioural problems. Some would become withdrawn, others would become discipline problems. The accumulated stress on families was substantial. The understanding of psychology in the 1800s didn't really allow for recognition of heat-related mental health effects. There was no framework for understanding that an environmental condition could produce psychological symptoms. Mental illness was understood as either a disease with a biological cause or as a character flaw or moral failing. The reality that heat could produce psychological distress wasn't really integrated into medical thinking. By the late 1800s, as understanding of psychology developed, there was some recognition that environmental conditions affected mental state. But the specific impact of heat on psychology wasn't really studied or understood until the 20th century. The social consequence was that people dealing with heat-induced psychological distress often had no validation or support. If you were depressed or irritable, that was seen as a personal failing, not as an understandable response to unbearable conditions. Some people would be blamed for their mental state, or would blame themselves. The difference that evening cool made psychologically was significant. As the sun set and the temperature dropped, irritability would often ease, mood would lift, people would become more engaged and social. The psychological relief that came with cooler evening was as important as the physical relief. Historians still argue about how much of the social upheaval and conflict in 19th century America might be attributable to heat stress and the psychological effects of summer. The hypothesis is interesting but difficult to test. What's certain is that the constant physiological stress of managing extreme heat had psychological consequences, and those consequences affected families and communities in ways that weren't well understood or managed at the time. As the 1800s progressed, people began to imagine that summer heat might not be an unchangeable fact of life. Innovation, mechanical solutions to the heat problem, started to emerge. These were mostly failures or impractical experiments, but they represented a fundamental shift in how people thought about heat. not as something to endure and adapt to, but as something that might potentially be solved through technology. Early attempts at mechanical cooling were crude. In the 1840s and 1850s, inventors experimented with devices that would move air, would use ice to chill air, or would employ pumps to move water through spaces. Some of these devices were purely mechanical, hand-cranked fans and ice fans. Others were early steam-powered systems that were experimental and often didn't work well. One interesting development was the refrigerating machine. In the 1850s and 1860s, inventors created mechanical devices that could artificially create cold through compression and expansion of gases. These refrigerating machines were initially huge, unreliable and expensive. They were used commercially for ice making and food preservation before they were ever used for cooling homes. But their existence represented a fundamental shift in thinking. Cold could be manufactured, not just harvested from nature. By the 1870s and 1880s, some wealthy people began experimenting with installing mechanical cooling systems in their homes. These systems used ice machines or early refrigeration equipment to produce cold, which would then be piped through the home or into specific rooms. The systems were unreliable, expensive, and often broke down, but they worked, at least sometimes, and they proved that mechanical cooling for homes was possible. The development of electricity changed everything. Electric motors could power fans which could circulate air. Electric refrigeration systems could be smaller and more efficient than steam-powered systems. By the 1890s, it was becoming clear that electricity would transform how homes were cooled. Here's a fascinating, quirky detail. Some of the early experiments with mechanical cooling were based on incorrect theories. Inventors would try things that didn't make physical sense, based on misunderstandings of how heat and cold worked. But through trial and error, some of these experiments would accidentally work, or would lead towards solutions that did work. The ice-making industry itself represented a kind of technological innovation. The ability to harvest ice in winter and preserve it until summer was itself a form of mechanical cooling, using nature's ice rather than manufactured ice, but still representing control over temperature. By the late 1800s, ice-making factories were becoming common, producing ice mechanically year-round rather than relying on winter harvests. The shift from harvested ice to manufactured ice was significant. Manufactured ice could be produced in summer when it was needed, rather than harvested in winter, and hoping it would survive storage. This meant that ice could become more available and potentially cheaper, which would expand access to ice-based cooling. Air conditioning, the mechanical system that combined cooling, dehumidification, and air circulation, was developing in the late 1800s. Early versions were created for industrial purposes, to create specific conditions for manufacturing and preservation. The idea that air conditioning might be used for human comfort was still speculative, but the technology was beginning to exist. The cultural shift was perhaps as important as the technological shift. The idea that heat was something that could be engineered away, rather than something that had to be endured, represented a fundamental change in worldview. Heat was no longer an inevitable force of nature. It was a problem that could be solved. This created interesting cultural tensions. Some people rejected the idea of mechanical cooling as somehow unhealthy or unnatural. The belief persisted that the human body needed to adapt to seasonal temperature changes, and that artificially creating constant cool might be harmful. But others embraced the idea enthusiastically. Wealthy people who could afford early mechanical cooling systems often became enthusiastic adopters. The development of electric lighting made evening activity easier, and extended how late people could be awake and active. This had the side effect of reducing the importance of the heat-driven schedule inversion. As people could be awake and active late into the evening under electric lights, the psychological shift from day to night became less urgent. But this development came at the very end of the 1800s, too late to affect most people's summer experience during the period we're discussing. By the 1900s, the possibility of comfortable summers was becoming real for wealthy people. The first commercial air conditioning installation for a space where humans lived rather than just worked happened in the early 1900s. But for most people, summer remained what it had been, a season that required adaptation, endurance, and management. The innovation that mattered most for the majority of people in the late 1800s was probably the hand-cranked electric fan. Simple, inexpensive by the standards of other cooling devices, and actually effective at providing cooling through air circulation, electric fans made a real difference in people's ability to manage summer heat. A house with a fan running could be noticeably cooler than one without. and the cost was low enough that working families might eventually be able to afford one. The trajectory was clear though. By 1900, technology would eventually solve the summer heat problem. Within a few decades, mechanical cooling would become more common and more accessible. Eventually, though this would take most of the 20th century, air conditioning would become standard enough that summer heat would cease to be a defining challenge of human life. The coming of electricity, and particularly the development of electric cooling technology, shifted cultural expectations about heat and human capability. By the 1890s, people were beginning to wonder, what if summer didn't have to be miserable? What if you could actually be cool? Electric fans were the first widespread application of electricity for cooling. A simple electric motor-driving fan blades could move substantial amounts of air with minimal effort. Unlike hand-cranked fans that required constant physical labour, electric fans could run continuously, providing constant air circulation. For the first time, cooling could be passive. You turned on the fan and it did the work. The appearance of electric fans in wealthier homes in the 1890s represented a significant shift. Having a fan running in a room meant that the room stayed noticeably cooler. You didn't have to fan yourself constantly. You could just sit near the fan and benefit from the air circulation. It seems like a small thing from a modern perspective, but it was genuinely revolutionary at the time. The electricity infrastructure itself was still developing in the 1890s. Not all homes or neighbourhoods had electricity. Some areas wouldn't have reliable electric service until the early 1900s. But in cities and wealthier areas, electricity was being installed in the 1880s and 1890s, and with it came the possibility of electric fans and other electric devices. The cost of electricity was initially high, which meant that running fans continuously during summer was expensive, but the cost gradually came down as infrastructure improved and demand increased. By the early 1900s, electricity was cheap enough that middle-class families could afford to run fans regularly. Refrigeration systems that used electric motors became possible in the late 1890s. These were still large and unreliable, but they worked more consistently than earlier systems. An electric refrigerator could produce ice continuously, which meant that ice became more available and cheaper. The cost of ice delivery and storage began to decrease as mechanical ice production became more economical. The cultural expectation shifted. If electricity could produce fans and cooling, what else might it produce? Could mechanical air conditioning be far behind? The idea that technology could solve environmental problems began to seem not just possible but inevitable. Newspaper articles and popular magazines began discussing the possibilities of mechanical cooling. The idea that future homes might be cooled mechanically, that summer might become comfortable, began to circulate in popular culture. Inventors were working on air conditioning systems, and there was genuine excitement about the possibility that they might work. Here's a fascinating, quirky detail. Some of the speculation about future cooling systems was remarkably accurate. Writers and thinkers imagined systems that would cool entire buildings through pipes and ducts that would remove humidity as well as provide cool air that would be automated and require minimal manual intervention. Many of these imaginings were essentially descriptions of what modern air conditioning would become. The psychological shift was as important as the technological shift. For centuries, summer heat had been an unchangeable reality. Families had adapted, had developed strategies, had accepted it as inevitable. But now, suddenly, the possibility that it might not be inevitable emerged. The next generation might not have to suffer the way their parents had. Summer might actually be comfortable. This created interesting generational differences. Older people who had spent their entire lives managing summer heat through physical and psychological adaptation sometimes viewed the new cooling technologies with skepticism. They'd adapted, they'd survived, and they wondered if artificially created coolness might be harmful. Younger people and wealthy people who could afford the technology often embraced it enthusiastically. The idea that heat tolerance might not be necessary began to circulate. If machines could create cool air, then humans didn't need to be heat tolerant. This represented a fundamental shift from a society that valued heat tolerance and adaptation to one that valued technological solutions. The virtues of endurance and adaptation were being replaced by the possibilities of technological mastery. The shadow of future comfort was falling across the 1800s by the 1890s. People who had lived their entire lives without any mechanical cooling could see evidence that such things might soon be available. They might die before they could benefit from these technologies, but their children might live in a world where summer was not a season of suffering, but merely a time when you were grateful for your electric fan and ice supply. The ultimate technological solution, air conditioning that would cool entire homes to comfortable temperatures year-round, was still decades away. Early air conditioning would be developed in the early 1900s for industrial and commercial purposes. Residential air conditioning would be rare and expensive until the 1950s and 1960s. But by the 1890s, the trajectory was clear. Technology was going to solve this problem. Heat was going to become optional. One last important aspect of summer life: the ethics of shelter sharing and the practice of visiting during extreme heat. When someone was suffering from heat stress, or when a family was facing genuinely dangerous conditions, social norms around hospitality and community support became crucial. In many communities, families would invite relatives or friends who were struggling with the heat to come stay with them. A family with a particularly cool house, perhaps one with good ventilation, or with access to a cave or cellar that was especially cool, would sometimes offer shelter to other families or relatives. The implicit understanding was that in extreme conditions, you didn't let your neighbours or relatives die of heat if you had the capacity to help them. These visiting arrangements could be formal, a planned visit where someone would come stay for a week or more, or informal, someone appearing at your door during a heat wave and implicitly asking for shelter. Many families felt obligated to provide what help they could. Turning away someone suffering from heat was considered deeply unethical, even if it meant stretching your own resources. The open-door policy during summer heat was partly practical and partly ethical. Practically, having more people in a space could sometimes make cooling coordination more effective, sharing labour, sharing access to cool locations. Ethically, there was a strong understanding that extreme heat required mutual aid and support. Some families would develop patterns of visiting. A family from a hot, poorly ventilated home in the city might spend several weeks each summer at a cousin's home in the countryside, where it was cooler. This visiting would be structured and expected, the annual summer migration that happened within extended families. Children might look forward to visiting cooler relatives as one of the few bright spots in summer. The logistics of hosting during summer were significant. An extra person or family meant additional food preparation, additional water use, additional pressure on whatever cooling strategies the home had. But most families felt that this was worth it. The ethics of mutual aid during extreme conditions overrode the practical burden. Here's an interesting quirky detail. Some families would actually hire out their homes during summer. A wealthy family with a particularly cool or well-designed home might rent rooms, or even the entire home to other families during the worst heat. This created a market for cool shelter, and also created an income opportunity for people with desirable properties. Seasonal workers and travelling labourers presented challenges and opportunities. A travelling worker might arrive during a heat wave and need shelter. Some communities would provide basic shelter, maybe a space in a cellar or a covered outdoor area for travellers passing through. The expectation was that you didn't let someone die of heat if you could prevent it, even if they were a stranger. The concept of community responsibility for vulnerable members, particularly children and elderly people, was significant. If a family had an elderly parent or grandparent or young children who were suffering dangerously from heat, other families in the community might become involved. There would be expectations that you'd help, and accepting help was sometimes expected rather than optional. Churches played a role in some communities. Religious obligations to help one another and to provide shelter to those in need meant that churches might become refuge centres during severe heat waves. A church with a large, cool basement or sanctuary might become a gathering place for heat refugees. The darker side of these arrangements was that visits could become exploitative. A visiting relative might stay longer than expected, creating strain on resources. Or a person offering shelter might expect payment or labour in exchange that went beyond what was reasonable. The ethics of mutual aid could be exploited, and relationships could become strained. Gender dynamics affected who could visit whom, and under what circumstances. An unmarried woman couldn't simply appear at a male relative's house during a heat wave. There were propriety concerns. She'd need a chaperone or proper excuse. The social structures that governed interaction sometimes prevented people from accessing cooling help that was available. The expectation to help could sometimes be burdensome. A family with limited resources might feel obligated to take in a relative, despite not having the capacity to do so comfortably. The ethical expectation to help could create genuine hardship for the helping family. By the late 1800s, the ethics of mutual aid in heat emergencies were becoming more formalised. Public health authorities began recommending that vulnerable people be moved to cooler locations during heat waves. Some cities began identifying cooler public buildings where people could gather during heat emergencies. The idea that summer heat was a public health crisis that required community response became more recognised. The practice of leaving doors open, both literally and figuratively, during summer heat was partly practical and partly cultural. An open door allowed for air circulation, but it also signalled that you were accessible, that you could be visited, that if someone was desperate for coolness or help, you were available. The open door policy was an implicit agreement that summer heat created conditions where people helped each other, because the alternative was suffering and death. This community support structure wouldn't have prevented most heat deaths or suffering, but it provided some safety net. Families in crisis had some chance of getting help. Vulnerable people sometimes could access cooler spaces. The worst suffering was sometimes mitigated by community response and mutual support. As we move toward the end of our journey through summer heat in 1800s America, we arrive at a final understanding. Families accepted heat as a force of nature that couldn't be fundamentally changed. Heat was normalized, expected, planned around. Some families would migrate seasonally, abandoning cities for cooler climates. Others would invest in properties specifically chosen for their natural coolness. The wealthy could escape. The poor endured. Seasonal migration became part of how some families structured their lives. The rhythms of the year included not just the cycles of agriculture or business, but also the cycles of heat. Some families would plan their entire year around heat, working and saving during cooler months, spending during heat season. Some would actively move their residents seasonally if they could afford it. The development of summer resorts and vacation destinations was directly related to heat management. Mountain towns and coastal areas that had been sleepy villages in earlier decades became fashionable summer destinations as wealthy families discovered they could escape heat by changing elevation or gaining coastal breezes. The entire tourism industry was partly built on the desire to escape summer heat. For rural families, heat patterns determined the agricultural calendar, which determined how you lived. Spring planting was crucial. Summer management, with inverted schedules and careful watering, was about survival. Full harvest was when the year's survival was secured. Winter was when you consumed what you'd preserved. The heat essentially determined everything about how you organised your life. For urban families, heat created cycles of migration. Some families would leave cities for relatives' homes in the country. Those who remained would experience a different city, emptier of wealthy residents but full of working-class people managing heat as best they could. The seasonal departure of the wealthy left cities partially depopulated, creating a different rhythm. The knowledge of how to survive summer was passed from generation to generation. Children would learn the protocols of their parents, when to rest, when to work, how to manage water, where to find coolness. They'd internalize the rhythms of summer without necessarily understanding them consciously. By the time they were adults, they simply knew how to be summer. Historians still argue whether adaptations to heat, the inverted schedules, the diet changes, the architectural choices, actually reduced the suffering of summer or just made it more tolerable. The reality is probably that both were true. These strategies didn't solve the fundamental problem of living in heat, but they made it survivable. They allowed families to continue functioning, to work, to eat, to sleep, to reproduce and raise children. Without these adaptations, the mortality rates would have been even higher than they were. The spiritual and psychological frameworks for understanding heat also evolved. Some people saw heat as divine punishment or test. Some saw it as a natural force to be managed and adapted to. Some saw it as a problem that human ingenuity might eventually solve. The framework people used to understand heat affected how they responded to it. By the very end of the 1800s, as we've discussed, the possibility that heat might not be permanent was emerging. Technology promised relief. Electricity and mechanical cooling systems were developing. The future was going to be different. Heat wouldn't always be unmanageable. But for most people living through the 1800s, heat was simply a fact. Your summer was hot. You adapted. You endured. And if you survived until fall, when the temperature finally dropped and the danger passed, you were grateful. Now let's ease into the ending of our time together. The story we've told, of families managing heat, of creativity and adaptation, of suffering and endurance, is a story of human resilience. People faced down a challenge that was genuinely difficult, that threatened their lives and their children's lives, and they found ways to survive it. They developed strategies. They supported each other. They passed knowledge to the next generation. The summer heat of 1800s. America shaped the lives and the choices of millions of people. It determined where they lived, how they worked, when they slept, who they married, whether their children lived or died. It was woven into the fabric of existence in ways that modern, air-conditioned people can barely imagine. And yet, these people weren't particularly special or different from us. They were doing what humans do, adapting, surviving, creating meaning and community in the face of difficult circumstances. Heat was their challenge. We have different challenges now. But the fundamental human capacity to face difficulty and survive, that hasn't changed. As the summer of 1800 slowly transitions to autumn and the temperature finally begins to drop, imagine the relief. The worst is passing. You've survived another summer. Your children lived. Your food was preserved. You made it through. Next spring the cycle will begin again. The temperature will climb. The protocols will restart. The summer heat will return. But that's a story for another time. For now, in this cooling autumn evening, as the air becomes pleasant again, as the pace of life slows from the frantic survival of summer, let your mind rest. The heat is passing. The worst has been endured. The sound of the fan in your room, the gentle coolness of your air-conditioned space, the simple comfort of being neither too hot nor too cold, these are luxuries that 1800s families couldn't access, but which we take entirely for granted. And that seems like a good place to end our journey. The families of 1800s, America faced their summer heat with ingenuity, community, faith, and sheer stubborn determination. They survived. And through their survival, they built the foundation for the future, including the future of mechanical cooling that would eventually transform summer from a season of survival to just another time of year. Sleep well, knowing that you live in that future they could barely imagine. Your comfort in summer is built on their struggle. Rest now, knowing that somewhere in this world, other families are still managing summer heat the way 1800s families did, through adaptation, through community, through the simple human determination to live. The night's growing deep. The fan hums softly. The darkness is complete and comfortable. Let your thoughts drift away now, away from the summer heat of centuries past, into the peaceful, cooling darkness of modern comfort. You've walked with families through their summer challenges. You've seen their ingenuity. You've understood their resilience. Sleep now. The heat that once threatened lives so constantly is now just a story. Something you know about. Something you understand. But something that no longer threatens you. In your air-conditioned safety, you can rest easily. The summer is gentle here. Let your breathing slow. Feel the gentle circulation of cool air. Your body can finally relax into true comfort, something those families would have treasured beyond measure. Drift now, gradually, peacefully, into sleep. The summer of 1800s. America is behind you now. Modern summer, manageable, comfortable, optional, awaits you in the morning. Close your eyes. Let the sound of your fan become distant and dreamlike. Feel your body growing heavy, your mind becoming quiet. You are safe here. You are cool here. You're comfortable in a way that would have seemed miraculous to those families who came before. Rest now. Sleep deeply. Dream of cool breezes and comfortable nights. Dream of the future that those families built toward without knowing it. Dream of progress and comfort and the human capacity to solve the problems we face. Dream gently into the night. As the deepest part of night settles around you, let the pace of breathing slow even further. The world outside your window is quiet now. The streets are empty. The heat of yesterday is a memory. There is nothing more for you to do tonight. No problems to solve. No heat to manage. Just the simple, profound comfort of being sheltered, being cool, being safe. Your bed supports you completely. The darkness is kind and gentle. Everything necessary has been done. Think, if you wish, about those families who managed what seemed impossible, but let those thoughts be soft, gentle, not demanding. They survived their summers. You are surviving yours. Life continues. The seasons turn. Heat and cold alternate, and humans continue. It is enough. Your breath is slow now. Your body is heavy with the pleasant weight of approaching sleep. Nothing is required of you except to be here, to be still, to let consciousness gently fade. The fan creates a soft boundary between you and the world, a gentle hum that says everything is well, everything is managed, Everything will be okay. If a thought comes, let it pass like a cloud crossing a night sky. You don't need to hold it. You don't need to pursue it. Just let it drift away, leaving you lighter. Your mind can release everything now. No problems need solving tonight. No challenges need facing. The cool air around you is like an embrace, gentle, constant, protective. It asks nothing of you except to breathe it in and let it cool your body. Let it calm your mind. The temperature is perfect. Everything is perfect right now, in this moment. Sleep is very close now. You can feel it approaching like a friend coming home. Your eyes are heavy. Your thoughts are becoming dreams. The boundary between waking and sleeping is dissolving, and that's exactly as it should be. Let yourself sink into the mattress. Let gravity become your friend. Let the weight of your body become something pleasant instead of something carried. Everything is held, you are held, the night holds you, the coolness holds you, safety holds you. And as sleep finally comes, as consciousness fades, like a gentle sunset into the darkness of night, know that you are resting in comfort that would have been unimaginable to those families we visited tonight. They struggled through the heat. You rest in coolness. The future came, and it came in part because those families endured and survived and built towards something better. Sleep now. Sleep deeply and peacefully. The night is complete. The story is done, and you are safe and cool and very, very tired. Sleep well.